Please take me and my daughter human, the alien cat girl begged. A cold wind sweeps over the cracked stone courtyard, stirring the dust in slow, spiraling eddies that brush against her feet. She kneels on the scorched earth, flame-red hair cascading around her face as she presses her trembling child against her chest, and for one suspended breath, either she nor the human moves. The tension is razor-sharp, the kind that makes the lungs ache as if waiting for a single sound might break the moment like glass. A shadow passes across the woman's feline-shaped ears, an unseen threat, or perhaps the final judgment, and still she does not speak. "Kill us quickly, human, if that is your plan," she finally says, lifting her gaze with a defiant glint. "But if you have even an echo of a soul, you will take my daughter from this place." Cale Roan stands 2 paces away, broad-shouldered and armed to the teeth, his rifle angled across his chest like a declaration of lethal intent. A trickle of sweat glides down the side of his face, but his eyes remain steady. He was bred for war, chiseled by it, carrying scars too numerous to count. At first, he doesn't answer. He merely studies her with that inscrutable smirk, the one that never warms his eyes, while the wind flutters the corner of his military-grade cloak. To see a Feyari woman pleading is a phenomenon he never expected. Their species has always been fierce, cunning, and impossible to break. Her voice reverberates with an underlying hum, a subtle vibration that hints at an otherworldly biology. Yet she's not snarling or hissing or launching an attack. Instead, she is challenging him with a request so outrageous it seems like a final, desperate strategy. He glances at the child. The girl's face is half buried in the thick orange fabric of her mother's cloak. Only the high curve of 2 tiny, fur-tipped ears is visible. The child does not make a sound, doesn't whimper or cry. She only watches him with luminous eyes so large they reflect the gloom of the courtyard. The old Cale would have dismissed all compassion, remembering precisely how many of his own people died by claws and fangs. But something about this moment unsettles him. He can't recall seeing a Feyari child in his entire military career. He lowers his weapon, but not by much. "Your kind doesn't beg," he says at last, voice harsh with suspicion. "So tell me why you're doing it now." Her name is Zeari. He sees it in the small insignia branded into the collar of her cloak, an alien script that the linguistics division would decipher, if she lasted that long in captivity. She presses her lips together, as though forcibly repressing the sharp retort that glimmers in her eyes. She might be kneeling, but there's nothing meek about her posture. Even pinned to the ground, she exudes the restless energy of a caged animal. And that voice, there's a subtle power in it, an almost hypnotic quality that makes his senses prickle. He can see a faint glow along her neck and cheeks, the legendary Feyari bioluminescence, rumored to be a seductive lure or a terrifying threat display, depending on the mood of its owner. "I said take my daughter," she repeats, forcing her voice not to tremble. "If you can't spare me, at least show her mercy." A black scuff of battle-worn boots signals Cale's approach as he closes the distance, overshadowing her with his height. He can see how she folds an arm around her daughter, a protective gesture that is both maternal and lethal. He's heard the stories of how Feyari mothers will rip out a throat with their bare hands if threatened. He's seen the footage of slaughtered outposts left behind by squads of alien warriors who took trophies for sport. Yet he also feels something conflicting inside him, because this woman, despite her bravado, truly appears ready to sacrifice herself. The question is why, and how he can use that to his advantage. He's expected to kill them. The official order is plain: no Feyari are to be spared, not after the horrors they committed on frontier colony Taris 7. Over 200 civilian bodies were found, many of them children. The memory alone sears into him, fueling the anger that crackles under his calm facade. He almost wants to refuse her out of spite. But there's something else, a curiosity, a crack in his rigid discipline that he can't yet reconcile. So he gestures with his rifle to the dim corridor beyond the courtyard. "On your feet. You'll come with me. But if you so much as twitch, I will put you down." She doesn't waste time questioning him. Slinging an arm beneath her daughter's legs, Zeari rises, pivoting with eerie grace. The child's face appears then, soft cheeks, luminous in the half-light. One of her tiny ears flicks, and it's such a gentle, helpless motion that Cale's grip on his rifle tightens, tension coiling in his chest. Soldiers in battered uniforms circle them as they move deeper into the fortress. The walls are pockmarked with bullet holes and scorch marks, remnants of the last incursion. Cale can feel eyes on them from every corner, the seething hatred directed at anything Fayari. She is the enemy incarnate, their unholy adversary. And yet he leads her deeper inside, heart pounding in a slow, heavy rhythm. He wonders if it's the adrenaline or something else he's refusing to name. They reach a holding cell near the fortress's core, a cramped space reeking of stale air and disinfectant. Chains dangle from the ceiling. Cale knows exactly how they're used. Protocol demands he lock her to the wall. But Zayari's gaze meets his, and for a moment, he sees an odd mix of defiance and resignation, as though she's been through far worse. Her daughter's big eyes flick between them, reading the unspoken tension. "Do it," Zayari says softly. "You've made your choice to bring me in. Might as well make certain I stay put." He steps forward, forcing her to turn. He clasps the cuffs around her wrists, ignoring the subtle tremor of her body. The child is still held against her mother's chest, the chain just long enough to permit that. Cale speaks through the intercom to the guard outside. "Bring a medic," he orders, trying to keep his voice cold. The alien's child looks weak. It's an impulsive move. He expects to be questioned for it, or worse. But no one dares to challenge the commander's orders, not in the immediate aftermath of a firefight. Tension thrums in the silence as Zayari lifts her chin, eyes shifting from him to the metal bands restraining her. She says nothing, and he says nothing back. Only the ragged breathing of her child fills the stillness. He steps out of the cell, sealing it shut. His men greet him outside, exchanging grim stares. "Sir," one of them says, voice laced with confusion. "You're aware of the standing directive. Any Fayari captive is to be executed immediately." Cale's jaw tenses. "She has a child with her. We're not savages. I want intel first." The soldier's mouth flattens, but he nods. This is the chain of command. Cale is in charge for the moment, though the higher-ups might question him soon enough. He feels the weight of that decision. If this woman truly is a threat, or if she's part of a larger plan, he's just endangered everyone by letting her live. And yet, he can't shake the echo of her voice, the way she demanded mercy for her daughter more than for herself. He heads to a small bunker-like office. The fortress is a patchwork of steel and stone, originally built by colonists, and later seized by the military. Now it's battered from an ongoing conflict that shows no sign of ending. Inside the office, he slumps into a chair, runs a hand through his short-cropped hair. His reflection in the dusty mirror on the wall is that of a man who hasn't slept in days, dark circles under his eyes, his features carved by fatigue and hardened emotion. He sets his rifle aside, takes a breath. A half-hour later, he returns to the cell. A medic is patching the child's bruised foot and checking vital signs with a handheld device. Cale's gaze flickers over mother and daughter. Zayari's posture is rigid, protective eyes narrowed on the medic. The child, Laika, is silent still, though her gaze darts to Cale with something akin to curiosity. The faint glow on her cheeks and ears suggests she's responding to the presence of strangers. Zayari shifts her stance as Cale steps into the cell, chains rattling. She no longer looks resigned. Her posture is coiled, ready. "How long do you plan on keeping us locked like animals?" she demands, not letting her daughter go. "Was your earlier kindness just a taste of mercy to make the execution more entertaining later?" He keeps his voice flat. "You're not dead yet, are you?" An anger flares in her luminous eyes, and the markings along her temples brighten in unison. She hisses softly, exposing canines that confirm the lethal rumors about her species. He doesn't move from the door, arms crossed, studying her. She's nothing like what he expected. He'd envisioned savage beasts with no capacity for pity or sorrow. He never imagined this controlled burn of fury, an intelligent creature who's half mother, half warrior. "I need information," he says. "About your people, your movements." If you cooperate, maybe I'll let you and your daughter keep breathing. She stares at him for a long moment, breathing shallowly. Her daughter curls into her chest, listening. The child's eyes flick from mother to the man who holds their fate. I have no illusions that your superiors would ever spare me, Zayari says. But I see no reason to make your job easier by turning spy. Kale approaches slowly, until the muzzle of his rifle is inches from her face. Think carefully. You want your child to grow up in some better place? Then answer my questions. Her lips curl as she meets his gaze, refusing to move away from the barrel. Don't presume you can make me talk. My silence might be the last dignity I have to give my people. He slams his free hand against the wall near her, frustration flaring. She doesn't even blink. The chain rattles once more as she flinches but tries to hide it. He can feel the tension radiating off her, a living force. It's strange how, in this moment of raw hostility, there's also an undercurrent of something else. Maybe it's because she's more than a soldier. Maybe it's the almost hypnotic pitch of her voice, the subtle shift of her body, or the way her eyes fix on him, unafraid. Let me talk to your daughter, he mutters. Zayari snorts, an almost feral sound. She barely speaks our tongue yet, much less yours. He doesn't believe her, but he crouches slightly. The child peers at him, large luminous eyes filled with a silent question. Laika, he says softly, testing the name on his tongue. Your mother's doing what she can to protect you. We want to help. He expects no response, but the child shifts, opening her mouth to speak. Only a faint squeak comes out, as though her voice simply won't form words. Zayari's breath catches, and Kale notices the twitch of her pointed ears, the sorrow that flickers across her face. Perhaps something traumatic happened, or perhaps the child was never able to speak. The intelligence in those eyes suggests she understands more than she lets on. The moment is broken when the guard outside unlocks the heavy cell door. Sir, he calls. We have a development. Your presence is required at the north perimeter. Kale straightens, stepping back. Stay put, he orders Zayari, like she has any other choice while chained. Then he leaves her there with the medic and 2 watchful soldiers. He heads down a narrow corridor, turning corners until he steps into a large room thick with the smell of gunpowder. Soldiers are gathered around a console projecting a holographic map of the area. Red dots flicker, indicating incoming hostiles. One officer looks up, face drawn with alarm. Commander, Feyari forces have been spotted just beyond the canyon. They're massing for an assault. That's impossible. The last incursion we had was nearly 2 days ago. Kale mutters. Where's our intel? Scrambled, sir. The signals are jammed. We're blind. We only picked up the movement on motion trackers. Kale's thoughts race. They have to mount a defense, but they're undermanned, supplies are low, and morale has been shattered by the constant losses. The fortress itself is half ruined, good for little more than a last stand. Prepare the turrets, lock down the perimeter. We need to hold them off until reinforcements arrive. The officer hesitates. Sir, reinforcements might not come for at least a day. We've had no contact since last night. We could be on our own. Kale sets his jaw. Then we hold. He issues commands, sending soldiers to man every vantage point. As he does, he can't stop thinking about the captive Feyari woman below, chained and waiting. Is she connected to the approaching forces? Is this entire scenario some elaborate ruse to infiltrate the fortress from within? He storms back toward the cell to confront her. As he enters, he sees that Zayari's eyes are sharper now, sensing the shift in the air. Your people have come, he says, voice tight with accusation. Are they here for you? She stiffens. I don't know what you're talking about. He can sense the flicker in her expression. Feyari or not, she's a mother. The arrival of her kin means one thing, an opportunity to escape. If they breach our defenses, you'll be caught in the crossfire, he warns. And so will your daughter. There is a subtle tremor in Zayari's lips, though she tries to hide it. Let me fight alongside you, she snaps. You think I want them to kill my child? There's a reason I ran. If they find me, We won't survive. Not after what I've done. Kale narrows his eyes. What have you done? She's silent for a moment, her gaze flicking to Laika, who stirs in her arms. The glow around the child's cheeks brightens slightly, as if sensing her mother's distress. I deserted, Sayari admits finally. In their eyes, I'm a traitor. I refused an order that would have required the slaughter of innocents. My own people cast me out. He sees the sincerity there, a flash of guilt and fear. She's telling the truth, or a damn good lie. And you want me to let you out of these chains so you can help us fight them? Her chin tilts up. Think of the advantage, human. I know how they move. I know their tactics. At least let me protect my daughter. If you want me to talk, this is how you'll get it. Kale hesitates for a heartbeat, then signals for the guard to release the cuffs. Protocol be damned, he needs every edge. The guard stares as though Kale has lost his mind, but eventually unlocks the shackles. Sayari stands, flexing her wrists, and she clutches the child closer. The medic offers no protest, but there's an air of alarm. Everyone in the room senses the potential danger. Sayari takes a tentative step toward Kale, her posture not exactly submissive but lacking the earlier rigid hostility. There's wariness in her eyes, but also resolve. If we're going to hold this fortress, we need to act now. They'll try to neutralize your defenses from the north ridge and create a diversion to the south. If you stay here waiting, you'll be surrounded. Her strategic insight sets Kale's pulse racing. He's forced to acknowledge this might be precisely the help they need. Fine, he says, hooking his rifle onto its harness. But understand this, if you betray us, even for a second, I won't hesitate. Her lips curl in a faint smile that doesn't hold much warmth. I won't betray you. Not if it means keeping my daughter alive. They rush out into the corridor, Kale barking orders for the men to follow him. Sayari keeps pace, ignoring the suspicious glares. Laika remains quiet in her mother's arms, and there's a subtle tension in the child's expression as they approach the perimeter. Kale can feel the frantic energy in the air, the swirl of panic, the metallic tang of fear. At the fortress gates, the wind howls across the canyon. Nightfall looms, casting long shadows. Sayari stands beside Kale, scanning the distance with eyes that reflect the faint glimmer of the setting sun. They'll send a scout first, she says quietly. A single fighter to test your lines. Then they'll drop a mortar volley. Kale shoots a glance at her, half impressed, half wary. You seem to know them well. She doesn't respond, but her ears flick, and the bioluminescent markings across her cheekbones pulse with muted light. It's a sign she's feeling stress or anticipation. Then, almost as if on cue, a single shape appears on the horizon, a lithe Feyari soldier, clad in dark armor, scanning the fortress. Kale signals to his men, but he hesitates to give the order to fire. They need to see if the rest of the force is in range. Sayari narrows her eyes. If we take that scout out now, they'll retaliate immediately, she mutters. You might want to wait until they're closer, or they'll shell us from beyond your gun's reach. Her logic is sound, and Kale grits his teeth. Waiting is a gamble, but so is attacking. Eventually, the scout recedes, presumably returning to the main group. The tension intensifies as the minutes drag on. Soldiers pace along the battlements, loading rifles and calibrating automated turrets. Kale catches Sayari's quick, anxious glance at Laika, who clings to her mother's side. The girl's eyes are wide but unwavering. A distant boom shatters the silence. The first mortar shell arcs overhead, slamming into the courtyard in a burst of fire and debris. The fortress trembles, dust raining down. Shouts echo through the corridors, scramble, brace, return fire. Kale roars orders, and Sayari hisses at him to follow her to higher ground. Together, they dart up a spiral staircase, ignoring the curious stares of his men. She points to the flicker of muzzle flashes on the far ridge. There. That's where they're dropping shells from. He radios to the artillery crew. Coordinates 15923. Fire at will. The fortress cannons thunder, sending their own barrage toward the ridge. An eruption of light blossoms in the distance, and a column of black smoke rises. For a moment, it seems they might hold them off. But the Feyari warriors are known for their cunning. From the south, a secondary force launches an ambush. The fortress walls rattle under explosive charges that blow open a breach. Kale's men rush to contain it, and soon the roar of gunfire and the screech of alien war cries fills the night. The smell of ozone, blood, and desperation chokes the air. Zayari grips Kale's arm. If you stay split like this, you'll lose both fronts. Focus your firepower on the south. The ridge is already hit, drive them back at the breach, or they'll swarm inside. He's torn, but her voice has that uncanny ring of certainty. He radios new orders, redeploying half the battalion to the south perimeter. She dashes alongside him through the corridor, child in her arms, though it seems insane to bring the little one into battle. Yet she refuses to leave Laika behind, not trusting these soldiers who would kill them if she turned her back. In the flickering light of distant explosions, Kale catches the fierce determination in Zayari's face. They sprint down a flight of steps into an open courtyard, just as a pack of Feyari troopers crashes through a partially demolished wall. The troopers see Kale in uniform, and their eyes flicker briefly to the woman beside him. A moment of confusion registers in their expressions. Why is she standing with the enemy? Zayari bares her teeth, shifting her grip so that Laika is hidden behind her body. Then, with lightning reflexes, she whips a small concealed blade from her belt, prepared to fight. Kale raises his rifle, bracing for the onslaught. The first trooper lunges, claws outstretched. Kale fires, the bullet ripping through the alien's shoulder. Zayari moves like a dancer, evading a slash and slicing across a soldier's leg, dropping him. Another tries to flank them from behind, but Kale pivots, launching a brutal strike with the butt of his rifle, sending the attacker sprawling. The courtyard is filled with the thunder of close-quarters combat, the clang of blades on armor, the bark of gunfire. Zayari moves with predatory grace, hair swirling like living flames, eyes narrowed with lethal focus. Laika cowers against the wall, covering her ears. Zayari hisses a warning to a trooper who attempts to grab the child, then drives her blade into his chest. Kale's smirk surfaces, a primal thrill of battle that usually masks his deeper scars. They fight as an unlikely team, each covering the other's blind spots. His raw power and disciplined training complement her speed and cunning. It's a savage dance, each second a fight for survival. When the last trooper falls, panting and bleeding, Kale glances around. Smoke rises from all sides, and the fortress walls stand battered but not yet broken. Zayari kneels by Laika, pressing a quick, trembling kiss to the child's forehead. "We need to get out of this open area," she says, breath ragged. "They won't stop until we're all dead." He nods, scanning the carnage. "The main hall is still intact. We can fortify there until we push them back. My men are regrouping." As they hurry along, stepping over debris and shattered bodies, Zayari's gaze flicks to the scar on Kale's forearm, noticing the blood trickling there. He's not even aware he was wounded, so high is his adrenaline. She reaches out, but he jerks away, unaccustomed to concern from a Feyari. She sets her jaw, focusing on guiding them through the labyrinth of corridors. Explosions rumble in the distance. The fortress lights flicker, threatening total darkness. They reach the main hall, where a handful of Kale's soldiers have set up a defensive line. Artillery booms overhead, but something about the pounding tempo suggests the Feyari might be pulling back. Kale kneels behind a barricade, panting, giving more orders. Zayari stands beside him, not as an ally but not quite an enemy anymore, her daughter clinging to her side. One soldier, a younger recruit, eyes Zayari with unmasked disgust. "Commander, what is she doing here?" He raises his rifle, and Kale shoots him a deathly glare. The recruit grudgingly lowers the weapon, still trembling with hatred. Zayari turns her back on the soldier, and keeps her gaze on Kale. "They'll circle around again. We have minutes, maybe less. If we don't prepare." A sudden crack splits the air as a mortar shell hits the roof overhead. Debris rains down, the shockwave knocking them backward. Dust and rubble fill the hall, and in that moment of chaos, Kale feels his world tilt. A chunk of concrete slams the side of his head, sending his vision spinning. He collapses, breath knocked out of him. The last thing he sees is Zayari dropping to a knee, shouting something he can hear over the roar of destruction, her arms coming up to shield Laika. Then darkness claims him. Kale wakes to a throbbing skull, an acrid stench in the air. The hall is quiet, too quiet, lit only by emergency lanterns. He pushes himself up, wincing, and finds Zayari crouched near him, gently slapping his face in an effort to rouse him. Her features are ghostly in the half-light, her eyes reflecting worry she tries to conceal. "Stop that," he growls, slapping her hand away. His head feels like it's about to split open, but he's alive. Her brows knit. "You were out cold for longer than you think. We have to move. The fortress is compromised, and your men are scattered." He clenches his jaw. "You and your people did this." She shows her teeth, a flash of frustration. "They're not my people anymore." She adjusts Laika's cloak, holding her close. Kale notices a trickle of blood on Zayari's temple, and he's not sure if it's hers or someone else's. She remains poised, lethal. "If you stay here, you'll be slaughtered when they breach again." Kale eyes the broken walls, the debris-strewn floor. Bodies of soldiers and a few Feyari troopers lie contorted in the wreckage. He sees glimpses of movement in the gloom, survivors rummaging for supplies or shelter. He tries to keep his calm to contact any commanding officer above him, but static hisses in reply. The jam remains in place. A voice crackles over a short-range frequency. "Commander, do you read? This is Sergeant Mills at the south flank. We're pinned, sir. We lost half the squad. Need backup immediately." The transmission ends with a burst of static. Kale curses under his breath. He hauls himself upright, using the jagged edge of a fallen column for support. Zayari stands close, Laika cradled in her arms. He can almost feel the heat radiating off her, an intensity that makes him uneasy. He doesn't want to rely on her, but he might have no choice. The fortress is near collapse, and if Sergeant Mills is under siege, that means there are more survivors to save. "We'll do this together," he says in a strained voice. "Help me evacuate my men, and I'll see to it you and your child aren't harmed." She nods sharply, though a flicker of skepticism lights her eyes. "Lead the way." They navigate the corridors, picking off stray Feyari troops in tense bursts of violence. Zayari's graceful movements contrast Kale's brute force. Each conflict is short and brutal, the air thick with the copper scent of blood. They find pockets of survivors, battered soldiers who stare in disbelief at the sight of a Feyari woman assisting their commander. Kale doesn't bother explaining, there's no time. He roars at them to follow or be left behind. Before long, they reach the south flank, where a handful of soldiers cower behind fallen beams. Sergeant Mills, a grizzled veteran, greets Kale with relief. But his face twists when he sees Zayari. "Sir, are we just letting them waltz around our fortress now?" Kale's temper flares. "She's helping us get out of here alive." "That's an order." Mills scowls, but he doesn't argue further. He gestures to a collapsed passage. "We can't go back the way we came, it's blocked. Our only route is through the old catacombs beneath the fortress, but we'd be trapped if the Feyari decide to chase us." Zayari speaks up, surprising Mills. "They'll be expecting you to flee above ground. They might overlook the tunnels if we move fast. You have no choice." Mills glances at Kale, uncertain. Kale grimly nods. "She's right. Gather what supplies we can carry. We're heading underground. Our objective is to rendezvous with any allied units outside this perimeter, or get far enough to call for extraction once the jamming lifts." The group sets off, a ragged band of a dozen soldiers, a Feyari mother, and her silent child. Their footsteps echo in the dank corridors, a hushed sense of dread settling over them. The lights flicker, arcs of electricity sputtering from severed cables. Zayari clutches Laika closer, her eyes narrowed in concentration. Kale presses a hand to his side, realizing only now how badly he's bleeding from a shrapnel wound. They descend a spiral staircase that smells of mildew and dust. The catacombs are a maze of stone passages, built centuries ago. Water drips from the ceiling, forming stagnant puddles on the floor. The darkness swallows them, punctuated only by the flicker of emergency lanterns and the glow of Zayari's bioluminescent markings. The others keep a wary distance from her, though she ignores their hostility, focusing on guiding her child. A muffled thud from above rattles the ceiling, sending dust cascading over them. The battle still rages on the surface, but they are plunging ever deeper into the earth, hoping to slip free of the carnage. Mills suggests a path leading east, where a heavy iron gate stands partially ajar. As they push through, Cale catches a stifled groan from one of the soldiers. The man clutches a wounded leg, face pale. Another soldier helps support him, but the pace slows. Zayari moves to the wounded man, surprising him by taking Lyca's hand so the child walks at her side. She kneels to inspect the wound. He tries to pull away, fear etched on his face. "Get off me, alien!" he hisses. "I don't need your help." She ignores him, pressing a clawed fingertip near the wound. He grits his teeth, but she's only checking how deep it is. She glances at Cale. "He can't walk far like this. He needs a tourniquet or he'll bleed out." Mills eyes her warily. "And why should we trust your medical know-how?" Cale interjects, frustration biting at his tone. "Unless you have a better solution, stand aside. We're trying to keep him alive." Zayari finds a strip of cloth from a soldier's torn uniform. With practiced efficiency, she ties it above the wound, twisting it tight. The man groans but doesn't resist. Lyca watches with wide eyes, clinging to her mother's side, silently absorbing the tension. Cale notices how the little girl stands on the edges of these harrowing moments, never crying, never speaking. It's as though she's seen too much already. They press on, deeper into the tunnels, the oppressive gloom closing around them. Each footstep splashes in shallow puddles. The stench of mold intensifies. With the fortress looming overhead, half destroyed, it feels like they're on borrowed time. Outside, the war rages on, and Cale can't help but wonder if they're escaping or heading into a dead end. At a junction, they pause. Mills consults a crumpled map, shaking his head. "I can't make sense of this. The catacombs weren't mapped thoroughly. We might be wandering aimlessly." Zayari brushes her fingers along a worn stone carving on the wall, her luminous eyes narrowing. "This script is ancient, but I recognize some patterns. Look." She points to symbols that vaguely resemble the mark on her collar. "My people have had dealings on this planet for centuries. This might be an old route used by my ancestors. If that's so, we could find an exit a quarter-mile to the north." The soldiers shift uneasily. Cale studies her expression, searching for signs of deception. "But what choice do they have?" "Lead us," he says. They move in single file, the wounded man hobbling with assistance. The soldiers keep a constant watch on Zayari's every step, fingers itching on their triggers. Cale notices that despite the tension, no one has made a move to harm her. Perhaps they realize her knowledge is vital to their survival. Or maybe they're waiting for her to slip up. A distant rumble resonates through the stone, suggesting further bombardment above. Dust sifts down, making them cough. Minutes bleed together as they follow the twisting halls. Then, abruptly, Zayari halts. She touches the wall again, scanning the symbols. "There should be a chamber ahead," she murmurs. "We might be close to an exit." At the same moment, a gurgling sound resonates behind them. They all whip around, weapons aimed. From a side passage, a lone Feyari soldier stumbles out, half his armor missing, flesh scorched. He stares at Zayari, eyes wide with recognition. Then, in a voice rattled by pain, he calls, "Traitor, you can't escape. They'll find you, cut you down, kill the half-breed whelp." Zayari's face contorts with fury. Before Cale can react, she lunges. Her blade slices the soldier's throat in one swift motion, silencing him. The soldier crumples, gurgling, blood pooling on the stone floor. The quick brutality of the act leaves the humans momentarily stunned. Zayari stands over the body, breathing hard, her markings flashing with violent intensity. Cale clenches his jaw. "You knew him?" She doesn't answer directly. Instead, she gives the corpse a final, contemptuous glance. "He would have killed us all." The men press on, though the tension has multiplied. Zayari's act of violence is a stark reminder of what she's capable of. Laika stares unblinkingly at the fallen soldier, but Zayari quickly tugs her away, refusing to let the child dwell on the scene. The group follows the corridor until they reach a massive round chamber, the ceiling arched so high it vanishes into darkness. A trickle of faint light seeps through cracks in the stone overhead. Mills lifts a lantern, revealing a ragged staircase winding around the chamber's perimeter. That might lead to the surface. If it's not collapsed? The soldier with the wounded leg groans again. Zayari helps him hobble along, her movement gentle despite the earlier display of lethal force. Kale finds himself watching her, a knot of conflicting emotions tangled in his chest. Everything about her is an affront to what he's been taught. And yet, there's a reluctant respect forming. She's risking her life, pulling them all along toward a chance at freedom. They begin the arduous climb, each step a test of endurance. Dust and pebbles rain from above. Kale takes point, searching for any sign of danger. In his mind, he replays the words of that dying Feyari soldier. Traitor. Half-breed. The accusation lingers. Does that refer to Zayari's daughter? Is Laika not fully Feyari, or was he merely speaking cruelty? A sudden quake shakes the structure. They cling to the wall as loose stones tumble past. One soldier loses his footing, nearly plunging into the darkness below, but Zayari grabs him with surprising strength, hauling him back to the stair. The man stares at her in shock, but she only nods curtly and continues upward. Their pace is slow, the group battered and exhausted. Laika struggles to climb, so Zayari lifts her, balancing the child on her hip. Finally, they reach the top of the staircase, emerging into a collapsed hallway. Rubble is piled high, but a crack in the ceiling allows a shaft of moonlight to pierce the darkness. The fresh air tastes of ash and smoke, but it's better than the stale catacomb stench. Kale and Mills begin shifting broken beams and stones, opening a passage. The task is grueling, but eventually a gap appears large enough for them to squeeze through. Kale goes first, pulling himself into the open night. The fortress above is in ruins. Fires flicker, and the sky is thick with swirling gray smoke. Bodies litter the ground, though a few scattered survivors pick their way through the wreckage. The jamming must have ceased at some point, because Kale spots a faint flicker of comm signals on a device strapped to his belt. He calls out softly, "All right, come on up, one at a time." One by one, the soldiers climb through. Zayari hoists Laika up, and Kale reaches down, lifting the child out. Their eyes meet for an instant. Laika's expression is neutral, but she clings to him for balance, her tiny ear flicking nervously against his arm. Zayari joins them last, emerging dusty and tired. She straightens, scanning the devastation. The group regathers, and Kale signals for them to move carefully through what remains of the fortress courtyard. The night's chill bites at exposed skin, and the acrid stench of burned metal and flesh assaults their nostrils. The battle has moved elsewhere, or perhaps ended in a stalemate. He can see a distant glow on the horizon, possibly from retreating enemy forces or scattered fires. Mills stumbles, cradling the wounded soldier. Another explosion in the far distance rumbles, but it sounds faint. Kale checks his comm device, trying to hail allied units. At last, there's a crackle of static and a strained voice. "This is Captain Lorne of the 47th Cavalry. We're nearing your position with ground vehicles. Any survivors, give your coordinates." Relief floods Kale. He relays their location, though it's precarious with rubble blocking most roads. They'll have to find a clear path or be picked up outside the fortress grounds. For now, the group stands in the broken courtyard, staring at each other. Kale can hardly believe that they made it this far. He looks at Zayari, noticing the dust smudged across her cheek, the faint smear of blood near her ear, and the subtle glow of her markings in the moonlight. She meets his gaze, chin raised, as if challenging him to condemn her. He doesn't. Instead, he jerks his head, signaling her to follow him. "We're going to find safe ground. Stick close." She doesn't thank him, but she stays near, Laika by her side, as they move out. The night feels dangerous and strangely intimate at the same time, like a battlefield on pause. Every breath is a reminder that they are still alive, that chance or fate, or a mixture of both allowed them to survive. Cale's chest tightens with conflicting impulses. He despises her kind for the blood they've spilled, but it's impossible to ignore her sacrifice for them now. They trudge through a crumbling archway, heading toward the perimeter that might lead to an open field. Sporadic gunfire echoes in the distance, but no immediate threats block their path. The soldiers glance warily at Zayari with every step, uncertain how to reconcile their hatred with her presence. She seems uninterested in their judgment, focused only on protecting her child. When they finally reach a broken gate that opens onto a field of jagged rocks, Cale halts the group. He motions them to take cover behind a fallen tower. The adrenaline is wearing off, leaving him shaky and in pain from his injuries. Zayari sets Laika down, resting a hand on the girl's shoulder as the child huddles close, eyes reflecting 1,000 horrors. Mills leans against a boulder, exhausted, the wounded soldier at his side. Cale scans the horizon. Headlights flare in the distance, friendly vehicles, if he's lucky. He reactivates his comm, signaling with a battered beacon. The cavalry is near. They just have to survive a little longer. Silence stretches, interrupted only by the soldiers' labored breathing and the crackling of small fires behind them. Cale glances sidelong at Zayari, a question forming on his lips. Before he can speak, she meets his gaze with a challenge of her own, that slight tilt of her head, a half-snarl, half-invitation. The tension is raw. He remembers how she fought by his side, saving his men. There's an electric current between them that neither fully understands. He tries to chalk it up to the haze of battle, but something deeper lurks, a primal pull he's never felt with any human. He pushes the thought away. The cavalry arrives, engines rumbling over the rocky terrain, and a small squad of uniformed troops emerges, rifles raised. At first, they stare in confusion at the ragtag group. Then their captain steps forward, eyes flicking over Zayari and the child. The muzzle of his gun dips in suspicion. Cale steps between them. "They're under my protection," Cale says, voice steady. "We're evacuating now." The captain looks like he wants to protest, but something in Cale's tone warns him not to. They load the wounded soldier onto a makeshift stretcher, then guide everyone into the armored transport. Zayari hesitates, scanning the stern faces of these new humans. She can sense their hostility. Cale places a hand lightly on her arm, and despite everything, she doesn't pull away. He climbs in first, offering his hand to help her up. Zayari studies him with those cool, feline eyes, then places her hand in his. Laika follows, clutching her mother's cloak. The door slams shut behind them, sealing them into a cramped, steel interior. The transport lurches forward, heading away from the fortress, away from the carnage. Inside, the tension crackles like static. A soldier at the back levels a stare at Zayari, one hand on his sidearm. Another grips his rifle protectively. Cale ignores them, placing himself beside her. Laika nestles on Zayari's lap, exhausted from the ordeal. Cale's shoulder presses lightly against Zayari's, and he forces himself not to dwell on the warmth that stirs there, despite the blood, the grime, the smell of war. This is insane, he thinks. She's the enemy, or was. Now she's something else. Nobody speaks. The transport roars into the night, taking them toward a forward operating base where they can regroup. The echoes of conflict fade behind them, replaced by the low hum of the engine. Cale closes his eyes, letting the pounding of his heart settle. An image intrudes, unbidden, of Zayari's fierce gaze in the heat of battle, and he can't quite banish it. When they arrive at the base, the scene is one of controlled chaos. Tents and prefabricated structures sprawl across the muddy ground. Soldiers rush to unload supplies, set up medical stations, and process refugees. Cale jumps out first, turning to help Zayari, but she waves him off, agile in her landing. Laika clings to her cloak, peering around with silent wonder. The child's mere presence draws stares. No one has seen a Fayari child this close. A pair of stern military officers spot them and hurry over, bristling with tension. Cale steps forward, offering a salute. "Commander Cale Roan, reporting. The fortress fell. These soldiers are the only survivors I could confirm. The officers nod, eyes flicking to Zayari. One of them, a tall woman with silver bars on her uniform, frowns. And her? Kale stiffens, but he keeps his voice firm. A Fayari defector. She helped us escape the fortress. Without her, half of us wouldn't be standing here. The woman snorts. Orders are clear. Any Fayari is to be detained for interrogation. The child, too. Zayari's ears twitch, and she shifts protectively in front of Laika. Kale holds up a hand. She deserves better treatment than a standard POW cell. She saved our lives multiple times. The officer doesn't look convinced. That will be for the intelligence division to decide. Until then, we will keep her under guard. Zayari's posture stiffens, a low growl vibrating in her throat. Kale feels a stab of sympathy, though he hides it behind his commanding facade. Allow me to remain responsible for her custody. I'll see that she cooperates. The officer eyes him, noting the rank stripes on his jacket, and grudgingly nods. Fine. But if she tries anything at all, it's on your head, Roan. They escort Zayari and her child to a guarded section of the camp, a high fenced enclosure that typically holds refugees awaiting processing. It's more humane than a prison cell, but still confining. Soldiers posted at every corner watch warily, fingers on triggers. Kale follows them inside, ignoring the pointed stairs. Zayari sets Laika down, glancing around at the chain-link fence and the swirl of anxious humans huddled under tarps. Most are civilians displaced by the war, their eyes filled with exhaustion. They gawk at the Fayari woman, some recoiling in fear or anger. Kale can see how it hurts Zayari, though she masks it behind a hard expression. Laika trembles, pressing against her mother. This is the best I can do for now, Kale says quietly, stepping close enough that only she can hear. He feels his heart lurch at the vulnerability in her stance. I'll make sure you get medical supplies. You and your child won't starve. She narrows her eyes, biting back a retort. Then she exhales, a shaky sound that betrays her exhaustion. My daughter needs rest. That's all I ask for the moment. He nods, noticing a soldier approach with a med kit and a couple of blankets. Kale takes them, then hands them to Zayari. She meets his gaze in a lingering moment, and he feels that spark again, an unsettling current. It might be anger or gratitude or something else altogether. Stay here until I sort this out, he murmurs. And don't do anything stupid. They're on edge. They'll be waiting for you to give them a reason. She lifts her chin. I've survived worse. He turns to go, but her voice stops him. Commander, she says, and when he glances back, her eyes burn with fierce sincerity. Thank you? He doesn't respond, only offers a grim nod. Then he steps out of the enclosure. Soldiers secure the gate behind him. Zayari stands amid the crowd of weary refugees, her orange cloak a striking contrast to their muted grays and browns. Laika's small face peeks out, eyes searching for something safe to cling to. Kale forces himself to walk away, heading toward the command tent. He needs to report everything, endure the barrage of questions, and pray that the higher-ups don't demand the immediate execution of his prisoners. He also can't shake the memory of how Zayari pressed herself against him in battle, how her voice thrummed with that low, hypnotic frequency, or how her eyes, defiant yet haunted, seemed to see right through him. His pulse still pounds, not just from the fight but from something that feels suspiciously like an undercurrent of attraction. He refuses to dwell on it. The war demands his focus. But as the night deepens, that memory lingers, like a brand he can't quite extinguish. Morning brings cold drizzle and a gray sky. Kale hasn't slept. He's spent most of the night being debriefed by commanding officers who question every detail of his unlikely alliance with the Fayari woman. They appear torn between suspicion and grudging admiration. The official stance remains unyielding. The Fayari are enemies, no exceptions. But Kale's testimony and the surviving soldiers' accounts make it clear that Zayari saved human lives. It complicates matters, so the brass decides to wait and see. Exhausted, Kale steps out of the command tent, wanting to check on Zayari. He's not sure what compels him, Perhaps duty, or perhaps something personal. He crosses the muddy path to the fenced enclosure. Refugees shift anxiously under tarp roofs. A guard stands at the entrance, eyeing Cale with a salute. Cale waves it off and steps inside, scanning the crowd until he spots her. She's huddled against a metal crate, cloak pulled around Laika. The child sleeps fitfully, her tiny ear twitching. Zayari's eyes are half closed, but they snap open the moment she senses his presence. She doesn't speak as he crouches beside her. He notices how the drizzle has dampened her hair, causing it to cling in wavy locks around her face. Her complexion looks pale, but her posture remains proud. She's every bit the warrior, even in captivity. He reaches into a pouch and pulls out a small ration pack. "I brought this," he offers. She eyes it warily, then takes it without thanks. She studies him in silence for a moment. The hush between them isn't quite hostile, but it simmers with tension. He clears his throat. "The officers are still deciding what to do with you. In the meantime, they've allowed me to keep you here, rather than in the brig." Her shoulders tense. "Lovely. One cage instead of another." His jaw clenches. "It's better than being bound in chains. You're alive, and your child is safe." She exhales, glancing at Laika, who stirs in her slumber. "I suppose I should be grateful. Though I doubt your superiors see us as anything but monsters." He doesn't deny it. Instead, he shifts his weight. "I need to know one thing. If you deserted your people, why?" Her lips part, revealing the hint of sharp canines. She could lie, he realizes, or stay silent. But she holds his gaze. "My daughter is part of me. She's innocent of the war crimes that define my kind, and I won't have her grow up in a world of slaughter. I defied an order that would have seen more humans killed. My own father was in command. I told him I wouldn't fight anymore. That is not something my species forgives." Cale processes this. The idea that a Feyari general would cast out his own daughter for refusing a massacre churns his stomach. He thinks of all the men and women he's lost, how the Feyari struck without mercy. And yet, here sits a Feyari mother who refused to kill, fleeing with her child. It upends his black and white worldview. "The soldier called Laika a half-breed," he says carefully. "Is your daughter fully Feyari?" Zayari's jaw sets, and for a moment, anger kindles in her eyes. "Yes. She was just hurling slurs. My child is as Feyari as I am." Cale can't help noticing she's being evasive, but he decides not to push. A flicker of relief crosses her features, as if she expected more interrogation. Their conversation lulls. Rain patters on the tarp overhead. Refugees move around them, but the two remain in their private space of tension. Finally, Zayari breaks the silence. "I can't stay here forever. If your people make up their mind to kill me, so be it. But my daughter deserves a chance." He nods slowly. "I'll speak to them. Explain that you might have intel we can use. If they see you as an asset, they're less likely to condemn you." She smirks, but the gesture is humorless. "Always a bargain, right? You want to use me. Isn't that exactly what you're doing with me?" he retorts, voice low. Her eyes flick up, meeting his stare with a challenge. "Yes. And you know it. We both want something from each other. At least let's be honest about it." He can't argue. The tension between them thickens, not just anger but something else, a current that hums in the charged space. He exhales, forcing himself to stand. She doesn't rise, she only watches him with those piercing eyes. With a curt nod, he leaves the enclosure. Behind him, the guard locks the gate. For the next several hours, Cale buries himself in the demands of the base, helping coordinate the rescue of wounded soldiers from the fortress ruins, overseeing supply distribution, writing up after-action reports. A steady stream of new refugees trickles in, each telling harrowing stories of burned settlements and marauding Feyari raiders. Cale does his best to remain stoic and efficient, burying any flicker of empathy behind his officer's demeanor. Late in the afternoon, an alarm suddenly blares across the camp. Cale rushes out of a tent, scanning for the source. Soldiers hustle to vantage points, rifles raised, pointing toward the horizon. Dust swirls, and in the distance, Kale sees a formation of vehicles approaching, human vehicles, but not from this battalion. As they grow closer, the insignia on their hulls becomes clear. It's General Harlan's brigade, known for brutality and a scorched earth approach to the Fayari threat. The vehicles roll in. Soldiers jump down, stern-faced, scanning the base. At their head is Colonel Bryce, a tall, imposing figure with an unyielding glare. Kale steps forward to greet him, saluting sharply. The colonel returns the salute stiffly. "We heard about the fortress," Bryce says in a clipped tone. "Your transmissions indicated you took in a Fayari female and her offspring. Is that correct?" Kale's stomach drops. "Yes, sir." Bryce's eyes flick with contempt. "General Harlan wants them transferred to our custody immediately. He believes they'll be of use in strategic operations." Kale knows what that means: torture or worse. "They surrendered to me under terms of cooperation," he says, voice tight. "The woman provided critical assistance. She's not a standard POW. My recommendation is to keep her here, under observation, while we gather more intel from her." Bryce snorts. "The general has other plans." "Where are they?" Kale's fists clench at his sides. He tries to maintain composure. "Colonel, with respect, they are not going anywhere until I receive direct orders from my chain of command. I outrank you in this sector. You outrank me in local command," Bryce says coldly. "But the general's authority supersedes both of us. We have orders to escort the Fayari female and child to our base, effective immediately." Kale can see a cluster of Bryce's men forming up behind him, bristling with weaponry. They're not here for negotiation, they're here to take what they want. Kale's mind races. If he resists, it could mean a direct confrontation with friendly forces. If he complies, Zayari and her child are doomed. Rage flares in him as he realizes how powerless this chain of command can make him. He forces a tight smile. "Then we should consult with my officers to confirm these orders, Colonel. Let's not do anything hasty." Bryce narrows his eyes. "I'm done talking." He motions to his men. "Find the alien and the brat. Secure them. Anyone tries to interfere, take them down." Kale's blood roars in his ears. As Bryce's men march off, he strides quickly to intercept them, shouting for his own soldiers to stand down but also refusing to let them muscle past. The camp descends into a tense standoff. Kale's men loyal to him shift uncertainly, not wanting to open fire on fellow humans. Bryce's soldiers fan out, sweeping the camp. Kale manages to get ahead of them, rushing to the fenced enclosure where he last saw Zayari. He arrives just as half a dozen of Bryce's men push their way inside. Zayari stands, cloak drawn around Laika, eyes snapping with alarm. Refugees scatter, not wanting to be caught in the crossfire. The men level their rifles at her. "Hands where we can see them!" one of Bryce's soldiers shouts. Zayari tenses, bristling with protective fury. Kale forces himself between them, raising his arms. "Stand down! She's cooperating. There's no need for violence." The soldier sneers. "Colonel's orders. We're taking the alien." Kale turns to Zayari, voice low. "Don't do anything rash. I'll handle this." She glares at him, her markings flickering with alarm. "If they take me, Laika will never see daylight again." Kale's heart clenches, but he can't bring himself to lie. The child clutches her mother's leg, silent tears gathering in her eyes. The soldiers draw closer, forming a half circle. Kale can almost feel Zayari's muscles coil as if ready to fight or flee. Panic swirls in the air like a palpable entity. "Commander, move!" another soldier barks. "Unless you want to face charges of insubordination." Kale doesn't move. Instead, he looks at Zayari, the conflict in his expression. She's cornered, trembling with anger and fear, but also determined not to let them harm her daughter. He sees the raw vulnerability beneath her fierce exterior, the same vulnerability that made him hesitate in the fortress courtyard. A flash of memory hits him, the moment she begged him to spare Laika, the moment she lowered herself before him, defying everything he thought he knew about her species. He knows if she resists, these men will shoot her in front of her child. He also knows if she goes peacefully, they'll take her and Laika to a place from which they might never return. Something inside him snaps. He steps forward, ignoring the rifle barrels pointed his way, and punches the nearest soldier in the jaw. The man goes down with a grunt. Another soldier yells and swings his rifle at Kale's head, but Kale blocks it, driving his elbow into the soldier's gut. Gunfire erupts as a third soldier fires into the air, sending refugees screaming in terror. Zayari reacts instantly, pulling Laika behind her, baring her teeth in a feral hiss. Her eyes dart wildly. She could kill these men, but it would spark an all-out firefight she can't win. Instead, she ducks behind a crate, shielding Laika. The soldier Kale punched is on the ground cursing, while the others regroup, weapons ready to put Kale down. Bryce's voice booms from outside the fence. "Stand down or be shot for treason, roan!" Kale's heart pounds. Time seems to slow, each breath a ragged heave. This is madness. If he continues, he risks his own life and the lives of those under his command. But if he doesn't, Zayari and the child are lost. He sees the flicker of movement as more of Bryce's men pour into the enclosure, rifles trained on him. He raises his arms slowly, swallowing the bitterness. "Let them go, Bryce. This is a mistake. She could be valuable intelligence. The child is innocent." Bryce steps in, face livid. "You have no authority here. You just attacked my men. You're done, Commander." Two soldiers seize Kale's arms, twisting them behind his back. He lets out a hiss of pain but doesn't resist. "Don't hurt them," he growls. "If you do..." "Shut him up," Bryce orders. One soldier strikes Kale in the gut, knocking the wind out of him. He doubles over, coughing, as they cuff his hands with thick restraints. Bryce's gaze sweeps the enclosure until he spots Zayari, crouched behind the crate with Laika. "You," he barks. "Step away from the child and surrender." Zayari slowly rises, teeth bared in a silent snarl. Laika trembles at her side. The other soldiers encircle them. Kale locks eyes with Zayari, silently willing her not to fight. It's suicide. She seems to understand, though her body shakes with repressed fury. She lifts her hands, the faint glow in her markings dimming as if all hope is draining away. One soldier yanks her hands behind her back, snapping special anti-fairy cuffs on her wrists. Another tries to pry Laika from her arms, and the child begins to shriek, not words, just a raw, terrified scream. "No! Please!" Zayari cries, twisting to keep Laika against her side. The soldier rips the child away, ignoring her screams. The sound is chilling, echoing across the enclosure, halting the breath of every witness. Kale lunges in reflex, ignoring the manacles on his wrists. "Stop! Leave the child alone!" But the soldier slams his rifle butt into Kale's shoulder, sending him sprawling. He lands face first in the mud, tasting blood. Bryce's men drag Zayari and Laika out of the enclosure, ignoring the stunned faces of refugees. Kale's heart twists violently at the sight of Laika's tear-streaked face, arms outstretched, crying for her mother. Zayari roars, a primal sound that tears from her throat. The glow of her markings flares in frantic pulses. She thrashes, but the cuffs restrain her vicious strength. "Move!" the soldier snarls, shoving her toward a transport. Laika is hauled in another direction, still shrieking. Zayari's eyes go wild. She tries to fight, but another savage blow from a rifle sends her staggering. A ring of rifles points at her, ready to end her life if she pushes too far. Kale watches helplessly, pinned by two armed men. Bryce strides over, sneering down at him. "I'll see you court-martialed for this, roan. You lost your damn mind, siding with these creatures." Kale tries to spit out a response, but it only comes out as a ragged wheeze. The last thing he sees before darkness creeps into his vision is Zayari's face twisted in despair, Laika's terrified screams echoing in the distance. Then the world tilts, and everything goes black. He comes to in a makeshift cell, a corner of some supply tent hastily converted into a detention area. The cuffs remain on his wrists. Pain knifes through his ribs each time he breathes, and dried blood cakes his mouth. Through the tense canvas, he hears the rumble of vehicles and the murmur of soldiers. They're setting up to leave or preparing for some new operation, he's not sure. Time blurs. At some point, a medic with the colonel's insignia on her sleeve comes in, checks his vitals, and leaves without a word. He's too weak to resist. He wonders if they've taken Zayari to some off-site facility for interrogation, if they're tormenting her right now, or if Laika is locked in a cage, wailing for a mother who can't answer. Hours pass, or maybe a day. The dull ache in his chest evolves into a sharper, more insistent pain. His throbbing head begs for water. No one comes. At last, the tent flap rustles, admitting a slender figure, a woman in the uniform of Kale's own battalion, though her face is partly shadowed by the overhead light. She crouches and speaks in a hushed tone. "Sir? Commander Roan?" He blinks, trying to focus. "Who's there?" "It's Corporal Isla." I had to sneak in," she whispers, glancing over her shoulder. "What happened here is wrong, sir. Bryce and his men took that Fayari woman and the child. They're planning to transport them to the black site tomorrow." Kale's heart twists. "And the others?" "They're frightened. Most just want to keep their heads down. Word is you're to be shipped off for court-martial. The colonel wants to make an example of you." He breathes carefully, forcing back the wave of nausea. "I can't let them take her," he mutters, though he's not entirely sure why. It's not just about gleaning intel, or some moral high ground. His mind conjures the image of Zayari's desperate face, the memory of her pleas to spare Laika. "Corporal, is there any chance you can get me out of these restraints?" She hesitates, fear stark in her eyes. "If they catch me." "Then go," he says, exhaustion heavy in his voice. "Save yourself the trouble." She steels herself. "No. You saved my brother on Tari's 7. I owe you." Without further words, she takes out a small multi-tool and fiddles with the cuffs, wincing at every tiny clicking sound. After tense minutes, the lock yields. Kale's arms drop, blood rushing painfully back into them. He winces but nods gratefully. "I have a sidearm for you," Isla whispers, passing him a compact pistol. "And a bit of water." She hands him a canteen, which he gulps, nearly choking with thirst. "We have to act now," he says, massaging his raw wrists. "Where are they holding the Fayari?" "In a separate containment area near the landing pads. The child is kept in an adjacent tent. They're going to load them onto a transport for the black site at dawn." Kale hauls himself to his feet, swaying. His body screams in protest, but he ignores it. "You're risking your life for this, Corporal." She bows her head. "We all believe the Fayari were mindless killers, but that woman, Zayari, she didn't have to help us back in the fortress. I saw her protect one of our own. Bryce is making a mistake. Let me help." He grips her shoulder, grateful, though he can't summon a smile. "Lead the way." Moving stealthily under the dim flicker of perimeter floodlights, they slip between tents and supplies. Most of Bryce's men are either patrolling or sleeping, preparing for an early departure. Kale's heart thunders with each step, a precarious mixture of desperation and raw resolve. Every fiber of him focuses on the single goal: get Zayari and Laika out before dawn. They reach a heavily guarded section near the base's edge, where a series of larger tents encloses caged holding cells. Kale crouches behind a stack of crates, scanning the guards. 2 men stand at the entrance to a particular tent that, based on Isla's intel, likely holds Zayari. Another guard paces around the perimeter, watchful. Further down, he sees a smaller tent, presumably for Laika. Isla leans close, her breath warm against his ear. "I'll distract the one on patrol. You handle the 2 at the tent." His jaw tightens. "Go." She steps out, casually approaching the patrolling guard with some fabricated excuse. It works well enough to lure him away. Kale waits until they're out of sight, then slinks across the open space, pistol at the ready. The 2 men at the tent's entrance are talking quietly. One has a cigarette, the ember glowing in the dark. Cale creeps up behind them, adrenaline spiking. He pistol whips the first guard in the base of the skull, sending him crashing to the ground. The second guard shouts in alarm, swinging his rifle around, but Cale slams his elbow into the man's chin, disorienting him. A swift kick to the man's knee buckles his stance, and Cale drives him into the ground, rendering him unconscious. The tent flap rustles as Cale slips inside. Lantern light illuminates a scene of heartbreak. Zayari chained to a metal column, battered and bruised, her eyes closed. She stirs when he enters, ears twitching, then lifts her head, the luminous glow on her cheekbones flaring faintly. She recoils at first, fear and anger contorting her expression. When she realizes it's him, confusion battles with hope. "You!" she rasps, voice cracking. "What? How?" He doesn't waste time explaining. He kneels, scanning her restraints. They're reinforced cuffs attached to thick chains. A ring of bruises circles her wrists. Fury boils in him at the sight. He rummages through a guard's belt for keys, hands fumbling. Zayari's markings flicker, her eyes locked on him. "They took my daughter," she whispers, voice breaking. "I don't know where. We'll find her," he promises. The cuffs click open, freeing her. She slumps, nearly toppling over. Cale catches her before she hits the ground, ignoring the jolt of heat that sparks at the contact. She's weak from abuse, but her spirit is unbroken. He slips an arm around her shoulders, helping her stand. She winces, leaning against him for support. "I didn't think I'd see you again," she admits. Her voice trembles, but she tries to hide it. "I couldn't let them take you," he murmurs, leading her out of the tent. The night air is cold, and she shivers. "Lycus in another tent. We'll get her, then we're leaving." They move as quickly as her injuries allow, clinging to the shadows. By some stroke of luck, they avoid detection, thanks to Isla's diversion. In the next row of tents, Cale spots a smaller one with a guard posted outside. The man's bored stance suggests he isn't expecting trouble. Zayari tenses at Cale's side, her breath quickening. He can feel the ripple of barely contained fury in her frame. Cale motions for her to stay put. He sets her against the corner of a supply crate, placing his pistol in her hand. She nods, though her grip trembles. Then Cale approaches the guard from behind, silent as possible. This time, the guard hears him a second too soon, turning with a start. He raises his rifle, but Cale lunges low, tackling him. They crash to the ground, struggling. The guard gets an elbow into Cale's ribs, aggravating his injuries. Cale hisses in pain but drives his fist into the guard's jaw, subduing him with a final blow. Panting, he drags the unconscious man behind the tent. Zayari stumbles forward, letting the pistol drop from her unsteady hand. She tears open the tent flap, calling, "Laika?" Her voice cracks in desperation. Inside, the child lies curled on a cot, bound at the ankles and wrists with thin restraints. She lifts her head at the sound of her mother's voice, eyes red from crying. A wave of relief visibly washes over Zayari. She collapses beside the cot, swiftly untying the bonds, hugging the trembling child close. Cale stands guard, heart pounding with an odd combination of triumph and dread. They've rescued Zayari and Laika, but escaping the base is another matter. Laika clings to her mother, tears silently streaming. Zayari murmurs soothing words in her own language, cradling the child's face in her hands. Her luminous markings shift from panic to a gentler glow, a sign of deep emotional release. Cale clears his throat softly, reminding her of the urgency. She nods, scooping Laika into her arms. They slip out of the tent. Isla appears from the darkness, face taut with worry. "Commander, we need to hurry. Colonel Bryce is making rounds soon." Cale gestures for Zayari to follow. "Corporal, do we have a vehicle?" Isla nods. "I stashed a transport rover at the eastern edge of the camp, near the old comm station. If we can get that far without being seen, we can drive out. The perimeter's thinly guarded since Bryce's men are focused on packing up." Without further delay, they hurry across the compound, hugging the shadows. Every step is torture for Cale's battered body. Zayari clings to Laika, eyes darting in paranoid circles, ready to fight if discovered. The child remains silent, though an occasional soft whimper escapes her lips. It's as if she knows that any sound might bring down an army. At the perimeter, a single guard mans the gate. Isla distracts him by hurling a rock to one side, drawing his attention. Kale, Zayari, and Laika slip through a narrow gap in the fence, crouched low. 100 yards beyond, in a small clearing behind the old comm station, sits a battered military rover. Kale helps Zayari into the passenger seat, while Isla climbs behind the wheel. He takes the back seat, scanning the area with the stolen rifle from the unconscious guard. Isla starts the engine, wincing at the roar. Immediately, lights flick on at the far side of the base. Shouts ring out. "Stop that vehicle! Go, go, go!" She slams the accelerator, the rover lurching forward. Soldiers scramble, and bullets ping off the metal plating. Kale fires back, though he's careful not to aim to kill if he can avoid it. They weave through the camp, tents whipping past in a blur. More gunshots echo, but the darkness and confusion work in their favor. Within minutes they break free, roaring onto a dirt road that leads into the night-shrouded wilderness. As they escape the glow of the camp lights, Kale exhales a breath he didn't realize he was holding. They're free, but not safe. Bryce will send pursuit. It's only a matter of time. Zayari sees her arms protectively around Laika, who's huddled in her lap. The child trembles, eyes wide and shell-shocked. Zayari's cat-like ears lie flat against her head, still bristling with adrenaline. Each labored breath she takes radiates the savage intensity of a creature ready to pounce if threatened. Isla drives with white-knuckled focus, cutting the rover's lights so they vanish into the darkness. Occasional moonlight illuminates the battered path. Kale keeps watch from the open back seat, scanning for vehicles or aircraft overhead. The wind whips through his short hair, stinging his bruised face. His thoughts swirl, an inescapable torrent. He's officially a traitor to his own command structure. He assaulted fellow soldiers, facilitated the escape of an enemy alien, and risked everything on a gut feeling that she deserves better. Part of him can't believe he's done this, yet here he is. They lurch over a rocky incline. The rover's engine whines, struggling, but keeps going. Zayari stares into the night, eyes reflecting the faint glow of starlight, and Kale can almost sense her mind racing. She holds Laika close, murmuring quiet words in a language he can't understand. The child rubs her tear-streaked face against her mother's shoulder, slowly calming. Kale's chest tightens at the sight, an unexpected pang of empathy surging through him. He can still recall the raw note of Zayari's cry when they tore her daughter away. Isla pushes the rover onward for nearly an hour, navigating old service roads that wind through craggy hills and gnarled vegetation. At last they come to a rest under a jagged cliffside, partially sheltered by towering stone. The engine pings and clicks as it cools. When Isla cuts the motor, silence blankets them, broken only by the hiss of the wind through the rocks. Kale is the first to speak. "We can't stay long. Bryce's men will be after us. We need to put distance between us and the base." Isla nods, exhaling shakily. "Let the engine rest a minute. We'll keep going soon." Zayari gently sets Laika down on the rover's seat. The little girl, exhausted from fear, clings to her mother's cloak. Zayari steps away, wincing at her injuries, then pivots sharply to face Kale. Her eyes blaze. For a moment, he thinks she might strike him. Instead, her voice trembles with fury. "They tried to separate me from my child. And you humans stood by." He meets her gaze, feeling the weight of her words. "I didn't stand by. I went against my own command to get you out." His tone is tired, pained. Her anger simmers, but it's mixed with something like confusion or reluctant gratitude. "You did," she concedes, the glow on her cheeks dimming slightly. Then she shakes her head, as if trying to dismiss vulnerability. "I won't let them take Laika again." Kale nods. "They won't." Isla steps between them, arms folded. "Look, we need a plan. Where can we go? The entire region is a war zone. Bryce has the authority to label us traitors, and your own battalion might not protect you. I know a place." Sayari says quietly. She glances at Kale, hesitant. Not far from here, there's a cluster of old mining tunnels used by smugglers. My people once patrolled them, but I doubt they still do. If we find refuge there, it might buy us time. Kale exhales slowly, considering the risk. It's better than waiting to be caught. Let's do it. Isla rubs her forehead, exhausted, but she starts the rover again. They drive in tense silence, each caught in their own roiling thoughts. Night stretches onward, and the faint glow of dawn begins to lighten the horizon. Time is running short. Bryce's men will be mobilizing, scanning for them with drones, or patrolling roads. Sayari guides Isla with murmured directions. The terrain grows rugged, the rover bouncing violently over ruts and rocks. At one point, a battered sign emerges from behind the undergrowth. Mining District. Authorized personnel only. The entrance to a tunnel yawns open at the base of a slope, partially obstructed by fallen debris. They stop the rover a short distance away, concealing it behind a natural rock outcropping. Isla kills the engine. Kale hops out, grimacing at the flare of pain in his ribs. He gestures for them to follow him on foot. Sayari holds Laika in her arms, though the girl is slightly older than a toddler, and the effort clearly strains her mother's battered body. Kale offers to help, but Sayari shakes her head, stubborn. The tunnel mouth looms, a dark void exhaling a damp, cold draft. Kale flicks on a small flashlight from the rover's supplies. Broken crates and rusted mining equipment litter the entrance, testifying that these shafts haven't been used in years. They slip inside, footsteps echoing on stone. The corridor narrows before opening into a cavernous chamber, the walls slick with moisture. Wooden support beams creak ominously, but they seem stable enough for now. Once deep enough that the outside light fades, they stop and circle around. Their breathing sounds unnaturally loud. Sayari gently sets Laika down on an old metal storage box. The child shivers in the chill air, so Sayari wraps her in the remains of her cloak. Isla steps away, examining the tunnel walls with a handheld scanner from the rover. No immediate life forms nearby, but that doesn't mean we're safe. The scanner range is limited. Kale adjusts the beam of his flashlight, painting the cavern in stark shadows. We should find a place to bunker down, maybe set up a watch. Bryce will figure out we've gone off-road eventually. Sayari crosses her arms, wincing at bruises. She glances at Laika with concern, then addresses Kale. I need medical supplies for my child. She was roughed up when they took her. And my injuries won't heal on their own. Isla pulls out a small first aid kit stashed under her jacket. I brought this from the base. It's not much, but it's something. Sayari eyes the kit warily. Thank you, she says, the words clipped but genuine. Isla nods in acknowledgement and hands the kit over. As Sayari begins tending to Laika's small abrasions, Kale leans against the damp wall, chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. He can't ignore his own injuries much longer. A warm trickle from his side suggests one of his cuts reopened during the escape. The world tilts slightly if he stands too fast. Isla notices, stepping closer, worry etched on her face. You're bleeding, sir. Let me look. She lifts the edge of his torn shirt, revealing a gash that's oozing dark blood. Damn, she mutters, rummaging in the kit for antiseptic. Hold still. Kale hisses as she presses gauze to the wound. Pain flares behind his eyes, forcing him to grit his teeth. He tries to distract himself by watching Sayari and Laika. The alien child flinches when her mother applies disinfectant, but she doesn't cry out. Kale notices faint bruise-like marks on the child's wrists, a testament to the rough way Bryce's men bound her. Anger roils in his gut at the memory. Isla finishes dressing his wound with shaky but competent hands. That's all I can do for now, she says. You need stitches, but we don't have the equipment. It'll do, Kale manages through clenched teeth. Sayari finishes tending Laika and turns her attention to her own bruised wrists and cracked lip. She dabs antiseptic, wincing at the sting, then wipes away the smeared blood and grime on her face. Her eyes flick to Kale, noticing how he watches her. For a moment, their gazes lock. The memory of their earlier antagonism, The conflict in the fortress, the heated stares, it all crashes down in that single instant. She looks away first, her cheeks flushing with renewed bioluminescence. Isla clears her throat, fiddling with the flashlight. I can scout ahead. Maybe see if there's another chamber or a more secure spot. We'll need to rest, but not too close to the entrance. She heads off into the tunnel, leaving Zayari, Kale, and Laika alone. Silence settles like a cloak. Kale forces himself to stand upright, testing the bandage on his side. Zayari rises as well, though she favors her left leg. Laika leans against the wall, quiet but watchful. Zayari's tail, small and furred, sweeping just behind her hips, flicks with agitation. Kale notices it for the first time, a subtle aspect of her physiology. He hadn't seen it under her cloak before. She catches him staring, and hers flattens slightly in annoyance, or maybe embarrassment. She steps toward him, and a flood of tension rushes between them. He wonders if she's about to berate him for leading her into this situation. Instead, she speaks in a low voice, one that resonates deep in his chest. Why did you come for me? You knew what it would cost. He can't lie, though the truth feels too raw. I saw what they were doing to you, to Laika. I couldn't stand by. He hesitates, gaze dropping to the dirt. I know what it's like to see innocents caught in the crossfire. She studies him, her luminous eyes unreadable. I thought all humans wanted us exterminated. That's what the war teaches us. He exhales. But maybe it's not that simple. A flicker of emotion crosses her face, too fast to name: relief, confusion, guilt. She grips her forearm, as if restraining herself from something impulsive. You risked everything. And your soldier Isla, too? He offers a faint shrug, stifling a grimace of pain. I had to. Besides, if you were with them, you'd be tortured or worse. She nods, biting her lip. The movement draws his eye, though he tries to remain stoic. The tension between them feels almost unbearable now, thick with shared trauma and unspoken attraction. It's as though each time they clash or unite in violence, the undercurrent intensifies. Laika shifts, drawing their attention. The child gazes at Kale with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. She slips her small hand into her mother's, refusing to let go. Kale softens, momentarily, though an unfamiliar ache lingers in his chest. He realizes its concern. He's actually worried about this tiny alien girl and her fierce mother. Zayari turns back to Kale, her voice hushed, as if not wanting Laika to overhear. I want to believe there could be peace. But I've seen too much bloodshed. He nods. So have I. Maybe we need to figure out a way through this that doesn't end in more death. She scoffs softly, a dry, humorless sound. And how do we do that, when your people would kill us on sight, and my people would tear me apart for treason? He can't answer. The gulf seems insurmountable. They stand there in the damp darkness of the old mine, unwilling allies, perhaps something more. The tension is suffocating, mixed with a flicker of hope. Finally, Isla returns, carrying the flashlight. There's a side tunnel that widens out, she reports. We can hide there for a bit, but I'm not sure how stable it is. Could cave in if the fighting reaches this area. Kale nods. We'll take what we can get. They gather their meager supplies and help Laika along. The child pads softly beside them, eyes darting in the flickering light. The side tunnel emerges into a hollowed-out chamber cluttered with rusted tracks and a broken mining cart. An overturned metal cabinet offers partial shelter, and a few stacked crates can serve as seating or barricades. It's far from comfortable, but it might keep them out of sight. Isla sets down her pack, rummaging for anything useful. Zayari clears a space for Laika to rest, spreading out a bit of cloth for a makeshift bed. The girl curls up, exhaustion pulling her eyelids closed. Kale can see that Laika is too worn out for fear. She drifts into a restless sleep, small chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Zayari gently strokes her daughter's hair, the maternal gesture raw and poignant. We should take turns keeping watch, Isla suggests quietly. I'll go first. Commander, you look like you might pass out if you don't rest. Kale hates to admit his frailty, but the throbbing ache in his side is constant, and every inch of him feels like lead. He nods. Wake me if anything happens. Isla chooses a spot near the tunnel's entrance, scanning with the flashlight turned low to preserve battery life. Zayari sits beside Laika, leaning against the cold stone. Kale lowers himself onto a crate, wincing as pain flares. Despite the discomfort, he closes his eyes, exhaustion washing over him in waves. The last thing he registers is Zayari's faint silhouette in the gloom, her gaze flicking toward him once before he slips into fitful sleep. He wakes some time later with a start, heart pounding in the darkness. The flashlight beam is nearly gone, replaced by a faint glow, Zayari's bioluminescent markings. She stands near him, arms folded, the subtle pulse of light reflecting in her eyes. Kale's mouth feels dry, and he shifts, grimacing at the pain in his torso. How long was I out? He croaks. Not long, she replies softly. I offered to take a watch. Isla's resting now. He rubs his eyes, glancing around. Laika sleeps a few feet away, still bundled in the cloak. The damp air clings to them all, and water drips somewhere deeper in the tunnel. Zayari steps closer, the faint greenish-blue glow radiating along her collarbones and temples. Kale forces himself upright on the crate, ignoring the stab of pain. You should rest too, he says, voice rough. You're hurt. She shakes her head, the movement causing a lock of crimson hair to fall across her cheek. Not until my daughter is safe. I can't let my guard down. Silence stretches. Kale notices the subtle shift of her stance, a mixture of wariness and something akin to curiosity. He's reminded of how they first met, that raw tension in the courtyard. Only now, it's layered with shared survival, secrets, and an attraction that sparks every time they're near. The air in the chamber feels thick, as if charged with electricity. He clears his throat. You said your father commanded you to kill innocents. That's why you deserted? She nods slowly, eyes drifting to Laika. Yes. We were ordered to annihilate any human settlement found aiding the war effort. That included unarmed civilians, children. I couldn't. She swallows hard. I couldn't look at my own daughter afterward if I did something like that. He understands the weight of that decision. Many of his own men see the Feyari as monsters, but here is one who refused a monstrous act. You did the right thing. A soft scoff escapes her. I'm alive, but now my own people would kill me if they caught me. I'm not sure how right it was. She glances at him, a question in her gaze. And what about you, Commander Kale Roan? Did you do the right thing, attacking your own men to save us? He exhales, reflecting on the damage to his career, his uncertain future, the condemnation from his own chain of command. A slow, bitter smile curls his lips. I don't know. But I had to do it. She steps closer, within arm's reach. The dim glow of her markings casts dancing shadows on the stone. He can smell the faint spice of her sweat, the metallic tang of dried blood, but beneath it all, something uniquely hers. It stirs something primal in him, the same sensation he felt in the fortress when they fought side by side. His pulse quickens, and he's painfully aware of the closeness. She doesn't back away. They stand there, battered and bruised from the day's violence, yet the tension between them feels alive. Each breath they take is charged, as though waiting for the next move. Her ears flick, and Kale notices the subtle dilation of her pupils. It reminds him that she's not human, and yet, in this moment, it hardly matters. He wonders if he should apologize for everything, or if he should ask her about her past. Instead, his voice comes out gruffer than intended. We should be careful. Bryce will send trackers. They might have drones scanning overhead. She nods but doesn't move. I know. That's why we can't stay here long. Their gazes lock in a silence that feels strangely intimate, given the darkness and danger lurking outside. He sees the flicker of emotion in her expression, gratitude, fear, guarded desire. There's no way to separate the lethal edge of who they are from the raw pull that draws them together, a magnetism neither of them can fully name. Her voice drops to a whisper. I hate that I need you, human. And yet I do. He lifts a hand, hovering it near her arm, unsure if touching her is wise. The memory of her scorching presence lingers from when he caught her in the fortress. She doesn't flinch, but her breath hitches. The tension is almost too much, like the coil of a spring about to snap. Then Laika makes a soft whimper in her sleep, stirring. Sayari turns away abruptly, crossing to her daughter and kneeling beside her. The moment is lost, replaced by maternal concern. She touches the child's forehead gently, whispering in Fayari. Kale clenches his jaw, banishing the pulse of desire that flared unexpectedly. He pushes off the crate, ignoring the pain in his side, and grabs the flashlight to check the perimeter. The distant walls glisten with damp. No sign of infiltration yet. Isla snores quietly in a corner, arms wrapped around her rifle. Kale sighs. She risked everything to help him free Sayari and Laika. Now, they're fugitives together, outcasts in this endless war. He can't imagine how they'll find a place to belong if either human nor Fayari sides will accept them. He dims the flashlight, walking back to where Sayari cradles her daughter. The woman's eyes flick up to meet his. She doesn't speak, but something unspoken passes between them, a fragile thread that ties them to each other, whether they like it or not. They settle into a tense watch, shoulders almost touching. The darkness weighs on them, but it also provides a strange intimacy. In the faint glow of her bioluminescence, Kale can see the slight curve of Sayari's lips, the shape of her collarbones, the bruises on her arms. He feels protective, despite knowing she's fully capable of killing him if she chooses. The paradox knits itself into every breath they share. Time crawls. An hour passes, or two. At last, Isla stirs, rubbing her eyes, taking over the watch. Kale and Sayari exchange a final glance, then doze off, side by side, the tension in their bodies never fully releasing. Sleep is shallow, haunted by nightmares of pitched battles and stolen children, but it's enough to keep them alive for another day. They wake to the soft glow of their battered flashlights, no sign of daylight this deep in the mine. Each of them feels the grind of exhaustion. Isla passes around ration bars, which they consume in grim silence. Sayari coaxes Laika to eat, but the child only nibbles. She's clearly still traumatized by the abduction, though she hasn't spoken a word. Kale stands, rolling his stiff shoulders. We need to move soon. Bryce won't rest. Isla nods. We can't outrun him forever. Where do we go? Before Kale can answer, Sayari lifts her gaze. I may have a lead. There's a place I've heard rumors about, an abandoned border station on the far side of these mountains. Humans and Fayari used it once for negotiations, before the war escalated. If it's still intact, we might find equipment to contact neutral parties, or at least get beyond Bryce's territory. Kale runs a hand through his hair, wincing at the residual pain. You think we can cross the mountains with what little we have? Sayari's expression is grim but determined. We don't have a choice. Staying here means waiting to be hunted down. If we reach the border station, there might be supplies, maybe even a small craft to get us out of this sector. Isla purses her lips. If the place is still operational, great. But if not, we risk freezing in the mountains or running into Fayari patrols. Kale weighs the risks, glancing at Laika's fragile state. They can't keep hiding in caves. They need a plan, and time is not on their side. Finally, he exhales. All right. Lead the way. With that settled, they gather their meager belongings. The trek through the tunnels is nerve-wracking. Every echo sets them on edge, but they encounter no one. Eventually, they find a narrow exit carved into the rock, hidden behind collapsed timbers. The morning sun stabs Kale's eyes when they emerge, illuminating a rugged landscape of rolling hills and distant peaks. The group sets off, trekking across uneven ground, mindful of every sound in case a drone or patrol picks up their trail. Sayari scouts ahead, her feline ears twitching, her gaze keen. Isla carries the rifle, scanning the horizon. Kale lags slightly, nursing his injuries, but forces himself onward. Laika walks in silence, hand in her mother's, too hollow-eyed to complain. They press forward for hours, the environment growing harsher. Rocky slopes, sparse vegetation, and biting wind that steals body heat. None of them are equipped for a mountain expedition, but desperation drives them. When the sun begins to sink, they find a rocky overhang for shelter. Kale and Isla scrounge for kindling amid the scraggly brush, managing a small fire that crackles and smolders against the biting cold. Zayari sits beside Laika, the flames highlighting the fine, downy fur on her ears, a stark reminder of her alien heritage. Kale takes a seat opposite them, warming his numb hands. The flickering light plays across Zayari's features, illuminating bruises that paint her skin. Despite the exhaustion etched into her posture, she remains fiercely protective of her daughter. At one point, Laika curls into her side, drifting into a doze. Isla volunteers to keep first watch again. The soldier stands at the edge of the firelight, scanning the dark horizon. Kale can't help but feel a rush of gratitude for her loyalty. She had every reason to remain at the base, but she chose to risk everything. He hopes he can repay that someday. Zayari shifts, clearing her throat softly. We won't survive the higher altitudes without better gear. The temperatures will drop below freezing. Laika can't handle that. Kale exhales, scanning their pitiful supplies. We have minimal blankets. No real winter gear. Maybe we can scavenge something in a settlement along the way? She bites her lip, an uncertain gesture he's come to recognize. If we pass a human settlement, you risk your own people reporting you. If we pass a Feyari settlement, we risk them capturing me for desertion. Neither is safe. He nods grimly. We'll find a way. We always do. Their eyes lock across the small fire. Somehow, in the hush of the night, the tension between them returns, sharper than ever. There's no fortress now, no immediate gunfire, but the threat of pursuit still looms. Perhaps that's why the undercurrent of attraction is impossible to ignore. It's fueled by the ever-present possibility of death. Each moment feels stolen. Before he can speak again, Zayari stands abruptly. I need to check the perimeter, she mutters, stepping away from the warmth. Kale watches her go, heart pounding. He notices how she carries herself, painful limp aside, she moves with a predatory grace, as though the environment is part of her. The shadows swallow her figure, leaving Kale alone by the fire with Laika sleeping nearby and Isla standing watch. He can't deny the confusion swirling in his mind. This alliance, this insane, impossible bond forming, he's risking everything for it. Hours crawl by. The cold deepens, forcing them to huddle together near the dying embers. Kale eventually dozes off, head resting against the rough stone. He wakes at dawn to the scrape of boots on gravel. Zayari returns, hair damp with morning dew, her lips pressed into a thoughtful line. Laika stirs, rubbing her eyes. They share a quiet look that passes for mother-child reassurance. Isla yawns, stretching stiff muscles. No sign of patrols, she reports, voice husky. But we should get moving. They break camp quickly, venturing deeper into the rugged terrain. Conversation is minimal, each person swallowed by their own thoughts. By midday, they reach a steep slope of loose scree that makes every step treacherous. Kale nearly slides off a small ledge, caught at the last moment by Zayari's lightning reflexes. She grips his arm, hauling him back onto stable ground. They share a charged moment, breathing hard, their faces inches apart. Then she releases him, stepping back. Thanks, he mutters, shaken not just by the near fall but by the jolt of contact. Her eyes linger on him, something smoldering behind them. A silent question, or perhaps a challenge. But then she turns, continuing onward. Laika struggles with the climb, and Zayari lifts her, pushing through the fatigue. Isla takes point, scanning the path for hazards. By late afternoon, they crest a ridge that overlooks a deep valley. Across the valley, half obscured by low-hanging clouds, loom the mountains. Somewhere beyond them lies the border station that might offer a slim chance of hope. Zayari suggests descending into the valley, where a winding river sparkles faintly in the distance. It could provide water and a bit of cover from aerial scans. The group agrees, though they're all pushing the limits of exhaustion and pain. As they pick their way down, the rocky terrain gives way to patches of scrub and hardy trees. It feels like a small reprieve from the barrenness above. Near dusk, they stumble upon an abandoned shack, a ramshackle structure made of metal scraps and corrugated panels. It sits near the river, half collapsed, but still offering 4 walls and a roof. With weary relief, they decide to shelter there for the night. Kale and Isla check the interior for threats, finding nothing but old crates and a rusted table. Zayari gently sets Laika down on a relatively clean corner of the floor, letting the child rest. Isla looks around. No sign of recent occupants. Might be safe enough for now. Zayari steps outside to gather kindling, her silhouette outlined by the deepening twilight. Kale follows, the cool air biting at his lungs. Together, they scavenge what little wood they can find. The act is strangely domestic, and yet fraught with tension, each movement reminding them they are fugitives, bound by mutual necessity. They return to the shack, assembling a small fire in an improvised pit near the door. Smoke rises through a gap in the roof. The warm glow flickers across bruised faces and hollow eyes. Laika dozes against her mother, lulled by the gentle crackle of flames. Isla rummages in their packs, taking stock of food and ammo. Kale rubs his temples, trying to manage the pounding headache building behind his eyes. Zayari, stroking Laika's hair, glances up at Kale. "Your wound needs attention," she says, voice quiet. He offers a humorless chuckle. "You're not a medic." She shrugs one shoulder, cradling Laika. "I've patched enough soldiers in my time to know when a wound is festering." "You're pale, sweating." He realizes with a start that he does feel feverish, his side burning. "I'll be fine." "Let me see it," she insists. Isla watches this exchange with a hint of a smirk, then busies herself with the rifle. Kale sighs, removing his jacket and partially lifting his shirt. The bandage is soaked through with dark fluid. Zayari sets Laika gently aside. Though the child stirs in protest, she remains curled in a half-sleep, and moves closer to Kale. Her face is unreadable as she kneels, gingerly peeling back the stained gauze. He sucks in a sharp breath, pain lancing through him. She grimaces at the sight. "It's infected. We need to clean it better." She looks up, eyes flicking with concern. "I can't promise I won't hurt you." He musters a wry smile. "I'll survive." She motions for Isla to bring the antiseptic. The soldier obliges, handing it over with a slight grimace. Zayari wets a clean scrap of cloth and gently presses it to the wound. Kale grinds his teeth, breath hissing between them. Her fingertips are cool against his feverish skin. The tension is palpable, each slow dab feeling almost intimate in the hush of the shack. Her luminous eyes flick up, meeting his for an instant, then return to the wound. He forces himself to stay still. It's excruciating, but oddly, the pain anchors him in the moment, keeping his focus on her soft breath, her unwavering concentration. She finishes cleansing it, then applies a fresh bandage with the care of someone who's done this before. When it's done, she sits back, exhaling. A thin sheen of sweat coats her brow. "Thank you," he manages, voice rough. She looks away, busying herself with the supplies. "Try not to move much. If the infection spreads, you won't make it to the border station." Isla steps in, offering a small canteen of water. Kale drinks gratefully, while Zayari returns to Laika's side. The child nestles against her, half mumbling in her sleep. For a moment, a fragile peace settles over them. The fire crackles, illuminating battered shapes and silent confessions none of them speak. As the night wears on, the temperature drops. They're forced to huddle close. Isla dozes off in a corner, rifle within arm's reach. Kale tries to stay awake, but exhaustion weighs on him. He leans against the wall, the heat of the fire lulling him. His eyes drift to Zayari, who curls protectively around Laika. He notices the trembling in her limbs, the after-effects of trauma and cold. Without overthinking, he shifts closer, offering some of his own body heat. She stiffens for an instant, glancing at him with a wary expression. Then, seeing no threat, she allows the proximity. Laika sighs softly, relaxing in the combined warmth of her mother and this human who shouldn't be an ally yet is. Time drifts. The crackle of the flames forms a lullaby of sorts, and Kale's eyes grow heavy. He's almost asleep when he feels movement. Zayari shifts, trying to keep Laika comfortable, and in the process her shoulder brushes against his. The contact is a spark in the darkness, a reminder that they're more than just survivors thrown together by circumstance. A swirl of conflicting desires spins in Cale's mind, but he can't act on it. Not here, not now. The line between them is too thin, too precarious. Still, the moment lingers. Her breath merges with his in the cold night. Then exhaustion pulls him under again, leaving them side by side, tethered by necessity, and something more they refuse to name. Dawn filters through the cracked walls of the shack, painting it in stripes of pallid light. Cale stirs, wincing at his stiff joints. Zayari is already awake, gently rocking Laika to soothe the child's nightmares. Isla stands at the doorway, eyes scanning the horizon. A hush envelopes them, as though the world itself is holding its breath. They eat a meager breakfast of ration bars, water, and whatever they can salvage. No one complains, though hunger gnaws at them. Isla and Zayari step outside to check for signs of pursuit. Cale packs up the meager supplies, then helps Laika to her feet. She clings to his sleeve, her tiny claw-tipped fingers hooking the fabric, and he's startled by the quiet trust in her eyes. He ruffles her hair gently, unsure if it's welcome. She doesn't pull away. When Isla and Zayari return, the news is mixed. No sign of Bryce's men yet, but the route ahead is treacherous. Snow caps can be seen on the mountain peaks. Their ragtag group can't afford to linger. They set off again, forging north toward the mountainous pass. The hours blur into a relentless march. Cale's side throbs, but Zayari's bandaging job keeps him functional. Isla leads with a stoic determination. Zayari helps Laika over obstacles, occasionally letting the girl ride on her back. Cale tries not to slow them down, though every step rattles his ribs. Near midday, they pass the skeletal remains of a small village, burnt-out structures that once housed humans. The sight is grim. Charred beams, broken windows, and the lingering stench of ash. Laika clings tighter to Zayari's neck, her eyes wide with fear. Zayari's expression is unreadable, but Cale senses her shame, recalling how her people's raids left many settlements like this. An abandoned storehouse offers a chance for supplies. They cautiously explore its soot-blackened interior. Most items are either destroyed or looted long ago, but Isla finds a stash of canned goods overlooked in a hidden storage bin. She grins, her first real smile in days. Cale sets about checking the rest of the structure for anything useful. Zayari remains outside, scanning for threats. He finds a closet at the back that contains ragged winter coats. He pulls them out, shaking off layers of dust and charred debris. They're worn, full of holes, but might provide some warmth in the mountains. He gathers them up, returning to Isla, who checks the labels on the canned goods, verifying they're still edible. Zayari peers in from the doorway. No movement outside. But we should hurry. Cale hands her the coats. They might help us in the cold. Choose one that fits you and Laika. She fingers the material warily. It smells of smoke. He offers a humorless snort. Everything here does. She nods, rummaging through the pile until she finds a child's jacket, which is slightly large for Laika but workable. Zayari herself picks a long coat that was probably made for a taller human, but it's better than nothing. Isla grabs one for herself. Cale takes the least damage for him, ignoring how the hem is torn. In the grand scheme, aesthetics don't matter. They gather the canned goods, stashing them into improvised backpacks. With each discovery, hope stirs, though overshadowed by the ghosts of the destroyed village. This place is a reminder of the war's brutality, a mirror to the atrocities both sides have committed. None of them speak about it, the silence hangs heavy. Resuming their journey, they push onward. The terrain becomes rocky once more, ascending steadily. The new coats block some of the chill, but the wind at these elevations slices through layers, biting exposed skin. They can see the first patches of snow clinging to jagged rock faces. Laika shivers, and Zayari tries to keep her daughter's face shielded from the wind. Isla rubs her gloved hands together, teeth chattering. When twilight looms, they seek a small cave nestled in a cliff. It's damp and cramped, but it shields them from the wind. They try to light a small fire, but the draft nearly extinguishes the flames. Still, it offers a sliver of warmth. They eat canned soup heated over the flickering embers. Laika manages a few spoonfuls before curling up to sleep. After dinner, the cold intensifies. Kale sees Zayari's trembling increase, her lips nearly blue. With only threadbare blankets, they have to huddle together. Isla remains near the cave entrance, shotgun across her knees, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. Zayari, Laika, and Kale cluster in the back, the fire's glow painting their faces with dancing shadows. Laika sleeps between them, nestled in blankets, her small body pressed close for warmth. Kale finds himself shoulder to shoulder with Zayari again, the press of her side against his a stark reminder of how unnatural this is, human and Feyari, forced into intimacy for survival. Every breath he takes draws in the faint scent of her, stirring that primal awareness he's tried to suppress. She notices, glancing at him with eyes half-lidded from fatigue. Her voice is a hushed murmur. "I hate this cold." He manages a wry smile. "We can't be far from that border station now. Another day, maybe two." She nods, gaze flicking to Laika's sleeping form. "It must be done. I have to believe there's something better on the other side." Her voice trembles slightly, betraying the cracks in her armor. Kale wants to offer reassurance, but he's never been good with words. Instead, he shifts, lifting an arm so Zayari and Laika can lean into the minimal warmth of his body. She tenses at the gesture, but her eyes reflect gratitude, or at least acceptance. She settles against him, her cheek brushing his shoulder. Her hair tickles his neck, the scent of smoke and something floral swirling around him. His heart pounds in his ears, but he keeps still, letting the weight of her presence wash over him. The hush of night closes in. Outside, the wind howls. Isla stands guard, though Kale sees her shivering, and wonders how long she can keep it up. Eventually, her silhouette returns to them. She crouches near the embers, warming her hands. A glance passes between her and Kale. No words, just understanding. They're all in this together, for better or worse. Hours creep by. The cold gnaws at their bones. Sleep claims them in fits, exhaustion overpowering fear. Kale drifts in and out of a strange haze, every muscle aching, the pain in his side pulsing. Each time he wakes, Zayari's warmth is there, her shallow breath stirring the air near his collar. It feels as if they'd found a fleeting moment of reprieve in a world gone to hell. By the time dawn breaks, Kale's entire body feels like ice. He forces himself awake, checking on Laika. The child stirs, blinking at him, her pupils wide and curious. He offers a small smile. "Hey," he murmurs. She doesn't speak, but she reaches out, touching his hand tentatively. He gently squeezes her fingers. A part of him wonders if she's truly incapable of speech or just traumatized into silence. Perhaps she's too young to articulate everything that's happened. Zayari rouses beside them, stretching stiff limbs. She mutters something in Feyari under her breath, likely cursing the cold. Kale carefully sits up, ignoring the stab in his ribs, and calls out to Isla. The soldier steps in from the cave mouth, shaking snow off her jacket. Her face looks pinched with cold, but her eyes are sharp. "Looks clear," Isla says. "No sign of drones. We should move." They extinguish the embers, gather their belongings, and press on. The air is thin and biting, each breath stinging their lungs. The path grows steeper, winding along narrow ledges. At times, the footing is precarious, forcing them to cling to the rock face. On one particularly sheer section, Kale's boot slips, sending a cascade of pebbles skittering down the slope. Zayari reacts instantly, grabbing his arm in a vice-like grip, stabilizing him. The flash of panic in his eyes meets the determined set of hers. She hauls him back onto solid ground, her breath ragged. He offers a strained grin. "You keep saving me." She doesn't smile back, but her tone is wry. "It's becoming a habit." They continue, slow and cautious. Isla scouts ahead, confirming the route is passable. By midday, they cross a ridge where frigid winds nearly knock them off balance. The sky looms gray and foreboding, the sun barely a pale disk behind clouds. Laika clings to Zayari, face buried in her mother's shoulder to shield against the cold. Kale trudges behind them, lungs burning. At last, late in the afternoon, they reach a plateau. Beyond it, Kale can just make out the shape of man-made structures near a distant pass. Zayari spots it too, ears pricking forward. "That must be the border station," she says, hope creeping into her voice. They pick up the pace as much as their bodies allow, half stumbling, half running across the snow-dusted plateau. The station gradually becomes clearer, a cluster of low buildings and a tall columns tower leaning at a precarious angle, battered by time and neglect. Overgrown paths lead to large blast doors, presumably for supply entrances. Though partially rusted, the structure appears intact enough to offer real shelter. An old chain-link fence sags around the perimeter, but it's easy to push aside. They slip through, weapons at the ready, adrenaline spiking in case of unexpected inhabitants, bandits, wild animals, or worse. The station's main entrance is locked, but Isla uses a crowbar from her pack to pry it open. The metal screeches, echoing in the silent pass. They step inside, flashlights cutting through the dim corridors. Dust and cobwebs fill the air, swirling in the beam. The station's interior is cold but not as bitter as outside, thanks to thick concrete walls. Signs written in both human script and an older Fayari dialect decorate the walls, marking areas for negotiations and customs checks. It's a ghost of what might have once been a place of uneasy alliance. They find a control room with a battered console and a few chairs. The windows overlook the mountain pass, giving them a vantage point of the roads beyond. Isla sets down her gear and exhales in relief. Zayari carefully lowers Laika onto a chair, wrapping the child in the tattered coat. Kale surveys the space, pulse still racing. It's silent, except for the low hum of wind outside. They split up to secure the area, checking adjoining rooms. Kale finds an old storage closet with dusty boxes of supplies. Most are ruined, but a few emergency blankets and some freeze-dried rations remain. He grabs them, heart lifting at the possibility of a real meal and insulation from the cold. Returning to the control room, he sees Zayari slumped against the wall, cradling her injured leg. Laika sits beside her, rubbing at half-frozen fingers. Isla fiddles with the console, flipping switches to see if there's any power. Nothing responds at first, but then a faint flicker lights up a screen. An ancient battery or backup generator must still have some juice. Isla gives a triumphant grin. "We might be able to power some systems if we can find the generator room. Maybe there's a comm link we can rig to send a signal." Kale nods, offering Zayari a blanket. She looks at it, then at him, and finally takes it, draping it over Laika. "Try to rest," he says softly. "We'll see what we can do about power." Before she can protest, Isla signals for Kale to follow her. They trace the corridor to a utility wing, guided by the faint emergency lights that flicker on. A sign reading, "Generator," points down a set of stairs. The air grows stale and musty as they descend. Broken lights dangle from the ceiling. At the bottom, they find a large metal door. It creaks open to reveal a chamber with rows of machinery, some of it covered in tarps. Isla wipes dust from a control panel. "If this station was fully decommissioned, there might not be enough fuel left. But if we can get something going, it might give us partial power. Let's see." She flips a few switches. At first, nothing happens. Then a low rumble vibrates under their feet. Lights sputter overhead. Kale exhales, relief flooding him. "Good. Let's not use too much power at once. We just need enough for heat and maybe the comm system." Isla nods. "We're risking detection if we power up everything, but it's better than freezing. Let's keep it minimal." She adjusts a few levers, the generator settling into a quiet hum. They head back upstairs to find Zayari and Laika huddled beside the console. A faint warmth seeps through the vents, a welcome change from the biting cold. Zayari lifts her head, a flicker of hope in her gaze. "You did it." Kale nods. "We have limited power. Might be enough to keep us alive and maybe send a signal." Isla taps on the console, scanning for a comm system. She finds a battered interface, half the buttons missing. I can try to patch this into a short-range broadcast. But we need to be careful. If Bryce is still searching, they could intercept our signal. Kale and Zayari share a look. We have to risk it, he says. We need allies, or at least safe passage out of here. Zayari nods reluctantly. I'll see if I can help interpret. Some of these instructions are in my people's old dialect. Maybe I can help you navigate it. Isla steps aside, letting Zayari examine the controls. The Fayari woman furrows her brow, reading the ancient script. She presses a few keys, and static crackles to life on a small speaker. A grin tugs at Isla's lips. So we have comm capacity. That's something. Laika perks up, listening to the static. Zayari toggles frequencies, searching for a channel that isn't pure white noise. Kale stands behind her, heart pounding. He wonders if there's anyone left out there who won't immediately see them as enemies. If they contact a human outpost, Kale might be arrested. If they contact Fayari, Zayari could be executed for treason. At last, they find a faint signal. A woman's voice crackles through, speaking a language Kale doesn't recognize. Zayari's ears flick, her eyes widening. It's Fayari, she says, adjusting the dials. A local patrol frequency, maybe. Kale's stomach knots. We can't let them trace us. Zayari hesitates, then switches to another channel, scanning for human frequencies. Most are dead or locked. Finally, a faint beep indicates an open channel. Isla seizes the mic. This is Corporal Isla Farn. We're seeking safe contact. Do you read? Over. Silence, then a burst of static. They try again. Minutes pass. Kale's heart sinks. Maybe no one is listening, or maybe they're ignoring the call. Suddenly, a garbled voice cuts through. Corporal Farn? Do you copy? Location? Over. Isla nearly drops the mic. We read you. We're at the old border station in Sector 9. We need assistance. The response is faint. Stand by, Farn. We're sending coordinates to your position. ETA uncertain. Over. Isla glances at Kale, her eyes shining with hope. It's the 12th Recon unit. They're known to operate independently, not under Bryce's command. If they come, we might have a chance. Zayari closes her eyes, relief and apprehension fighting for control of her expression. Kale squeezes her shoulder gently. We'll see who arrives. If they're friendly, we can negotiate for safe passage. If not, we'll handle it. She finishes, meeting his gaze. There's a spark in her eyes, reminiscent of every time they fought side by side. For the next few hours, they make the station as livable as possible. Isla and Kale seal cracks in the walls to preserve heat, while Zayari checks rooms for additional supplies. They find an old bunk area with cots, dusty but serviceable. Laika curls up on one, drifting off to exhausted sleep. The hum of the generator provides a comforting backdrop, though it might also be an invisible beacon drawing adversaries. Late that evening, after a meager meal, Kale and Zayari sit together near a small heater they manage to restart. Isla patrols the corridors, staying alert for any sign of visitors. Outside, the wind howls over the pass. Kale can't tell if it's snowing, but the chill that seeps in suggests a storm. Zayari's gaze drifts to her sleeping child. I still can't believe we made it this far. He nods. Me either. But we're not safe yet. She sighs. If your 12th Recon unit shows up, do you really believe they'll help us? Or will they see me as an enemy? He rubs his face, weariness tugging at him. I don't know. They're not under Bryce's command, that's something. Maybe they'll listen to reason. She scoffs softly. And if they won't? His mind flashes to the betrayal at the base, the way he attacked his own fellow soldiers. Then we'll do whatever it takes to protect Laika, he says, voice firm. A beat passes in the low light, the hum of machinery underscoring their conversation. Zayari's markings pulse faintly, a sign of heightened emotion. Her lips tighten, as if she wants to speak but can't find the words. Then she leans closer, her voice a bare whisper. Commander Kale Roan. I don't know if it's fate or cruelty that threw us together, but there are moments when I feel. She cuts herself off, eyes dropping. He feels his pulse surge. The tension between them is almost tangible. In another life, they might be enemies trading bullets. Here, battered by the cold and the echoes of war, they cling to each other out of more than just necessity. Every brush of their arms, every charged glance, is like a fuse burning toward an inevitable explosion. He reaches for her hand, curling his fingers around hers. She tenses, her claws biting into his skin for an instant. Then her grip relaxes, and she laces her fingers through his. Heat flares in his chest, a heady mix of desire and desperation. He leans in, their breaths mingling, and he wonders if this is insane. She's Feyari, the very species he was sworn to destroy. Yet the press of her body, the low vibrations in her throat, calls to him in a way he can't deny. Her voice trembles. You realize this can't end well. He shifts closer, the raw edge of his breath fanning her cheek. I don't care. We don't get many choices in war. This is one I'm making. Their lips meet in a fierce, desperate clash, more a battle than a kiss. She gasps, nails digging into his shoulders. He groans, mind spinning, the taste of her sending a shockwave through his entire body. The blanket of exhaustion and pain lifts for a moment as they cling to each other, each refusing to yield. It's not gentle, not a lover's embrace. It's the savage surge of two warriors grappling with fate. At last they part, panting. Her markings glow brightly, broadcasting her swirling emotions. His heart thundered so loud, he's certain Isla could hear it from the next room. Zayari's eyes brim with conflict, fear, desire, disbelief. She almost pushes him away, but instead, her fingers curl in the fabric of his coat, pulling him close again. He braces a hand against the wall to keep from collapsing into her completely. A ragged laugh escapes him. You're something else. Her lips curl in a half sneer, half smile. I don't recall giving you permission to make me vulnerable. He kisses her again, lips pressing against the corner of her mouth, tasting salt and iron. She shudders, gripping him with bruising force. Yet there's something tender lurking beneath the violence, a shared understanding that they've crossed a line. They're no longer just cautious allies. They're locked in a primal bond neither can fully articulate. Footsteps in the hall make them freeze. Isla steps into the room, clearing her throat. Zayari hastily releases Kale, turning away to compose herself. Kale stands, chest heaving, the flush on his face obvious. Isla raises an eyebrow but says nothing, just adjusts her rifle strap. Everything okay? Kale asks, voice uneven. Isla nods, though her gaze flickers with curiosity. Yeah. No sign of movement. You two should get some rest. I'll keep watch. Zayari retrieves her composure swiftly, kneeling beside Laika and tucking the blanket around her. Kale remains standing, pulse racing. He can still taste the lingering heat of her kiss. A swirl of guilt and longing tangles in his stomach. This is madness. But as he settles down on a crate across the room, he sees Zayari glance at him with a look that could devour him whole, and he knows there's no going back. The base hums around them, a sanctuary and a trap. Tomorrow, maybe the 12th Recon will arrive, or maybe Bryce's men will track them. Either way, they've reached a point of no return. Kale closes his eyes, exhaustion pulling him under, the memory of Zayari's mouth on his fueling restless dreams. Dawn brings a swirl of snow outside. The station's windows reveal a pale haze. They gather around the console, hoping for a signal from the 12th Recon. Static buzzes in the background. Kale paces, scanning the outdoors with binoculars. Zayari keeps Laika occupied, feeding her a bit of warm soup heated on the station's old stovetop. Isla fiddles with the comm, occasionally tapping out a message. At last, a crackle. A voice comes through. Corporal Farn, this is Lieutenant 7 of 12th Recon. We're inbound on your position, ETA 10 minutes. Acknowledge. Isla snatches the mic. Roger that, Lieutenant. We're in the main control room. Approach from the south entrance, it's the safest route. Copy. Stand by. Kale's heart pounds. He shoulders his rifle, exchanging a look with Zayari. Tension crackles in the air. Laika, sensing the anxiety, clings to her mother's leg. Zayari's tail flicks with nervous energy. Outside, the snow whirls, obscuring visibility. Kale can only hope these new arrivals won't be a repetition of what happened with Bryce. Minutes pass like hours. Finally, they hear the rumble of engines outside. Shadows move in the swirling white. Isla signals for everyone to stand back from the door, rifles lowered but ready. Kale positions himself protectively near Zayari and Laika. The main doors groan open, letting in a blast of icy wind. Figures in winterized Recon gear step inside, weapons raised. "Corporal Farn?" a voice calls. Isla steps forward cautiously, hands where they can be seen. One of the Recon soldiers lowers his rifle, revealing a stern face with a lieutenant's insignia. "We got your message. Are you all right?" Isla glances at Kale, then gestures to the group. "Sir, this is Commander Kale Roan, formerly of the Fortress Battalion. We have a Fayari defector and her child, seeking sanctuary. Colonel Bryce was..." The lieutenant's gaze snaps to Zayari, eyes narrowing. "A Fayari? This is highly irregular." Kale steps forward. "I take full responsibility. She aided our escape from the fortress, saved human lives. Bryce intended to torture her and her child. I refuse to comply." The Recon soldiers exchange uneasy glances. One murmurs, "We heard rumors of Bryce's actions. The man's gone rogue." The lieutenant exhales, appraising Zayari for a tense moment. She meets his stare, refusing to cower. Laika clings to her cloak, trembling. Finally, the lieutenant nods. "We're not Colonel Bryce's men. We follow Captain Durrell. He's more reasonable. If what you say is true, we'll hear you out." Kale breathes a sigh of relief. Zayari's shoulders relax slightly. The lieutenant motions for his squad to stand down. "We'll escort you back to our forward command. The captain will decide how to proceed. But no harm will come to you or the child, as long as you cooperate." Zayari nods, though she keeps a hand protectively on Laika's shoulder. The Recon unit helps them gather their supplies, offering heavier coats for the journey. One soldier, a medic, immediately checks Kale's side, clucking in disapproval. Another gently examines Laika's bruises, offering basic first aid. The difference in demeanor from Bryce's men is stark, a relief that softens the tension coiled in Zayari's frame. The group piles into two armored transports parked outside, engines idling in the snow. Zayari holds Laika on her lap in the back of the lead vehicle, with Kale wedged beside them. Isla sits up front with the driver. The Recon soldiers remain alert, but not hostile. As the vehicles rumble away from the station, a sense of guarded optimism settles in. They navigate the treacherous mountain pass, then descend toward a rocky plain. The storm subsides as they lose elevation. Kale peers out a window, spotting the faint outlines of a sprawling encampment in the distance, ringed by makeshift walls. Bright lights glimmer. That must be the forward command center. He glances at Zayari, who stares straight ahead, lips pressed in. "Are you okay?" he murmurs under the hum of the engine. Her ears flick. "I don't know. I'm not used to trusting humans. Even less used to them trusting me." He nods, resting a hand on hers. She allows the touch, though her pulse thrums rapidly. A subtle tension flickers in the set of her jaw, as if bracing for another betrayal. Laika dozes on her lap, lulled by the transport's vibrations. Within half an hour, they arrive at the gates of the Recon camp. Barricades part, and the transports roll inside. Soldiers shuffle about, many wounded or weary, but they bear the insignia of a unit known for discipline and fairness. The vehicles park near a large command tent, and the squad escorts Kale, Zayari, Laika, and Isla inside. They're greeted by Captain Durrell, a tall woman with streaks of gray in her hair, eyes sharp with experience. She listens to the lieutenant's summary, gaze flicking between Kale and Zayari with measured intensity. At the mention of Bryce, her lips curl in distaste. Finally, she steps forward, addressing Zayari directly. "We don't often receive Fayari visitors who come in peace, especially with a child. I can't guarantee how our superiors will react, but for now, you're under our protection. No one will harm you here. Zayari lowers her head slightly in acknowledgement, a gesture that's neither submissive nor defiant. I only ask for safety for my daughter. I'll answer any questions you have. Captain Darrow meets Kale's gaze. As for you, Commander, you're facing potential charges for assaulting fellow soldiers. But circumstances might grant you leniency if everything is as Corporal Farn described. Kale swallows hard, remembering how he attacked Bryce's men. I'll cooperate. Darrow nods. Good. For now, rest. We'll debrief you once we confirm the details. If Colonel Bryce tries to come here, he'll have to go through me. The tension in Kale's chest loosens, replaced by a cautious relief. They're directed to a medical tent first, where a young medic bandages their wounds and checks vitals. Zayari stays close to Laika, who endures the examination with wide, silent eyes. A wave of sadness washes over Kale, remembering how carefree children should be, how war robs them of innocence. Afterward, they're shown to a small sleeping area. Basic cots, but it's warm and safe. Laika crawls onto one, too exhausted to protest. Zayari sits at the edge, stroking her daughter's hair. Isla heads off with the Recon soldiers to debrief. Kale sinks onto another cot, exhaling shakily. Zayari looks at him through the dim light, her expression cautious yet earnest. Thank you, she whispers. For saving us, for not abandoning us. He nods, exhaustion pulling at his consciousness. I couldn't do anything else. She lifts a hand as if to touch him, then drops it, mindful of the open space with other soldiers around. Rest, she says softly. We'll face whatever comes next together. He closes his eyes, letting the hum of distant activity lull him. The next hours blur, snatches of fitful sleep, background chatter, the beep of medical devices. He vaguely registers officers stopping by to question him or Zayari, but Captain Darrow keeps them from pressing too hard. At some point, Isla brings food, which they eat mechanically. Day turns to night once more. The camp settles into a subdued rhythm. Kale can't sleep, restless with the knowledge that Colonel Bryce might be hunting them still. He sits up, scanning the tent. Zayari is dozing on her cot, like a curled at her side. Her features in sleep are peaceful, almost vulnerable. The faint glow of her markings pulsates with each breath. Despite everything, she's alive, and for now, safe. Quietly, Kale steps outside. The air is cool, but not as biting as the mountain pass. Guards patrol the perimeter. He nods at them, wandering until he finds a spot by a portable heater. The sky above is clear, stars shimmering like distant promises. Footsteps approach behind him, and he turns to see Zayari, cloak drawn, arms folded. She glances at the soldiers, then gestures for him to follow her behind a supply crate where they can speak in private. He joins her, heart picking up pace. The shadows hide them from prying eyes. She leans against the crate, studying his face. Laika's asleep again. She murmurs, I couldn't rest. Not knowing what happens next. He nods, stepping closer. I know the feeling. For a moment, they just stare at each other, the memory of that desperate kiss in the station fresh in his mind. She shifts, and he catches a glimpse of uncertainty in her eyes. Do you regret it? She asks, voice low. He knows what she means without clarification. No, he says, stepping closer. But I don't know where it leads. She laughs softly, a mirthless sound. We're a soldier and a deserter, a human and a Feyari. You think there's a place for us after this war? He lifts a hand, gently brushing aside a lock of her hair. She doesn't recoil. I don't know. But I'm tired of letting other people decide our fate. She exhales, tension thick in the space between them. So am I. The next instant, they collide in a fierce embrace, mouths seeking each other with an urgency that defies the quiet night. Her claws dig into his back, and he grips her hips, pulling her flush against him. It's a clash of teeth and breath and pent-up longing, more raw than romantic. Yet beneath the desperation is an undeniable connection that neither can escape. She breaks the kiss, panting, resting her forehead against his. Her markings flicker, reflecting the tumult of her emotions. I won't let them take my daughter, she whispers. I won't lose you either. He nods, swallowing hard. I'll fight for you both. It's a simple vow, one he never thought he'd make to a Fayari. But in this moment, it feels like the only truth he knows. They stand there, huddled in the shadows, aware that any passing soldier might stumble on them. The war outside these fences hasn't ended, but for a few stolen minutes, it recedes. She cradles his face in her hands, pressing a lingering kiss to his forehead, a gesture that feels intimate in a way beyond raw passion. He tightens his arms around her, feeling her warmth against his battered body. A distant shout snaps them back to reality. She pulls away first, eyes darting toward the tents. We should go back before they notice. He gives a reluctant nod, letting her slip from his embrace. She wraps her cloak tight, smoothing her disheveled hair. With a final glance that brims with conflicted tenderness, she turns and heads toward the sleeping tent. Kale remains behind for a moment, steadying his breathing, trying to contain the wild fire coursing through him. Finally, he follows, re-entering the tent to find her already on the cot beside Laika, feigning sleep. He settles on his own cot, mind racing. The only certainty is that everything has changed. Morning dawns with a flurry of activity. Captain Durrell summons Kale, Zayari, and Isla for a formal debrief. They gather in a briefing tent, surrounded by charts and communication devices. Durrell stands at a table, arms folded, as they recount their ordeal. Isla explains how Bryce planned to torture Zayari and Laika. Zayari confirms she deserted her own people to protect her child. Kale shares the details of how they escaped the fortress, crossing the mountains. Durrell listens intently, occasionally glancing at the holographic map that shows shifting battle lines. Bryce's forces are rumored to be in the area, she says. He's likely hunting you. As for the Fayari side, we have no intel on whether they care about chasing deserters. Zayari's expression hardens. They do. I betrayed them. If they find me, they'll make an example of me. Durrell sighs. Then you have enemies on both sides. She looks at Kale. You as well, Commander. Assaulting fellow soldiers is a grave offense, though under the circumstances, I believe you acted to protect a child from harm. Kale's throat constricts. So what happens to us now? Durrell exchanges a glance with a tall man in Recon armor standing at her side. He steps forward, clearing his throat. I'm Lieutenant Home. The captain and I agree that you won't be safe in any standard command post. Bryce has the authority to arrest you on sight. The Fayari forces would likely do the same to her. He nods at Zayari. Durrell continues, We're not heartless. We can't ignore the fact that Zayari saved human lives. However, we also can't openly defy the chain of command if Bryce pushes the issue. Isla's jaw sets. Then what do you propose? A wry smile curves Durrell's lips. We can give you a transport, enough supplies to survive, and look the other way while you leave this sector. There's an unaligned region beyond the western frontier, a place where either side has a strong presence. It's dangerous, full of smugglers and outcasts, but it might be your best chance. Kale glances at Zayari. She takes a moment to process, then nods slowly. I'll take my daughter anywhere that offers a chance for peace. Isla hesitates. What about me, Captain? Durrell's expression softens. Corporal Farn, you're not facing charges. You can stay with us. You're valuable here. Isla's gaze flicks to Kale. With respect, Captain, my place is with them. I can't stand by while Commander Roan faces danger alone. Durrell studies her, then inclines her head. Very well. Your loyalty is commendable. Just know that once you leave our protection, we can't guarantee your safety or your return. You'll be on your own. Isla looks at Kale, her eyes steady. I understand. Durrell steps around the table, placing a data chip in Kale's hand. Coordinates for a safe route out of the war zone. It's not guaranteed, but it's your best bet. Bryce won't expect you to head west. You'll have to move fast to avoid detection. Zayari exhales, a mixture of relief and tension. Thank you, she says quietly. Durrell nods. Don't thank me yet. The path is treacherous. There's a reason no one else goes that way. But if you survive, you might find a place to lay low, raise that child, and figure out how to end this war in your own way. They share a final exchange of respectful salutes and wary hope. The plan is set. At first light tomorrow, the Recon team will stage a diversion, and Kale's group will slip away in a lightly armored transport, disguised to look like a scrap hauler. That evening, they prepare diligently, packing medical supplies, rations, and personal belongings. Zayari ensures Laika is bundled in layered clothing. Isla double-checks weapons. Kale helps load the vehicle, each step feeling surreal. He's a fugitive from his own cause, yet he feels more alive, more purposeful than ever before. Night falls. They gather in a quiet corner of the camp, away from curious eyes. Laika nestles in Zayari's arms, half asleep. Isla stands watch, giving Kale and Zayari a moment of privacy. He studies the Fayari woman in the dim glow of a single lantern. She meets his gaze with a fierce, searching intensity. Are you sure about this? He asks, voice subdued. She nods. I have no other choice. You're the only one I trust. For now. He sets a hand on her cheek, thumb grazing the bioluminescent markings near her temple. They pulse under his touch, as though responding to his heartbeat. I'll protect you both. She leans into his palm, eyes fluttering closed. For a second either breathes. Then she pulls away, clearing her throat. We need rest before the journey. They find a secluded spot near the transport, bed down under the watchful eyes of Recon soldiers who guard the perimeter. For the first time in a long while, Kale sleeps without jolting awake from nightmares of the fortress. Instead, his dreams swirl with visions of an unknown horizon, a land beyond the war, where he stands beside Zayari and Laika under a sky unblemished by smoke. Dawn arrives cold and sharp. Captain Durrell personally leads them to the vehicle, a worn-down transport fitted with false plates. She shakes Kale's hand firmly. Good luck, Commander Roan. May this war eventually end, and may you find your place in the aftermath. He nods, swallowing a lump in his throat. Zayari lifts Laika into the passenger cabin, Isla hopping in after. Kale climbs into the driver's seat, checking the instruments. Durrell signals her squad to move out, launching a patrol that will draw attention away from the camp's west exit. Go now, she orders. And don't look back. Kale starts the engine. The transport rumbles, gears grinding. He steers out of the camp, passing through the hastily opened gate. A swirl of dust and cold morning air envelopes them. Zayari settles in the seat beside him, Laika on her lap. Isla takes the rear seat, scanning the horizon with a rifle in her lap. They drive for hours, following the coordinates on the data chip. The landscape is bleak and uninviting, rocky outcroppings, twisted shrubs, scattered debris from old battles. Yet there's a haunting beauty in the emptiness. Each mile puts them further from Bryce's grasp and deeper into the realm of the unknown. As the sun arcs overhead, Kale glances at Zayari. She's watching the horizon, her profile still regal despite exhaustion and bruises. He recalls the first time he saw her, kneeling in the dust, begging for mercy for her child. Now they're escaping together, forging a path that defies every logic of war. The sun sets behind distant hills, painting the sky in molten reds and golds. They stop near a dried riverbed, too tired to continue without rest. Isla sets up a rudimentary perimeter alarm. Kale and Zayari tend to Laika, sharing the last of the warm ration packs. Night descends cool but not biting, a subtle shift from the mountain's frigid peaks. When Laika dozes off in the transport's back seat, Zayari and Kale slip away to the edge of the riverbed. The air is still, the sky infinite above them. She stands with her arms wrapped around herself. He approaches, heart swelling with quiet awe. Despite the scars and the bloodshed, despite the uncertainty of the future, there's a calm in this moment that feels almost sacred. He moves behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders. She relaxes into him, tail brushing his leg. They watch the stars in silence, the hush broken only by the soft chirp of night creatures. After a long moment, she turns in his arms, sliding her hands up his chest. Her eyes shine with a subdued glow, expression earnest. I never imagined this. She murmurs. A fairy mother and a human soldier, running together like outlaws. He brushes a strand of hair from her face. Outlaws or free. Depends on how you see it. She gives a quiet laugh, resting her cheek on his chest. I'll take freedom. If it means Laika grows up away from bombs and gunfire, I'll bear any label. He holds her close, breathing in the warmth of her skin. The memory of their savage kisses in the station returns, igniting a flame in his blood. Yet this moment is different, gentler, imbued with the promise of something beyond mere survival. He tips her chin up, meeting her gaze under the moon's glow. She leans in, pressing her lips to his, a soft contact that carries all the pain and hope they share. It's not a clash of teeth this time, but a melding of hearts. He closes his eyes, sinking into her warmth, feeling the soft vibration of her purr against his chest. The breeze whispers across their entwined silhouettes. When they pull apart, her eyes glisten with unshed tears. We're really doing this, she whispers, voice trembling. He nods, brushing his thumb over her lower lip. We are. In the distance, Isla stands watch, respectfully averting her gaze. Laika sleeps peacefully, sheltered in the transport. The war rages far behind them, or maybe it's just waiting to catch up. But for now, they belong to no side, bound only by the primal bond forged in the throes of conflict. Zayari slides her hands down his arms, interlacing their fingers. Come. Let's rest. We'll need strength for whatever comes next. He follows her back to the transport, where they settle in for the night. Laika barely stirs, curled against the seat. Kale and Zayari share a blanket on the ground beside the vehicle, bodies pressed together under the starry expanse. He feels her heartbeat against his, a steady rhythm that defies fear. In the hush of the desert night, he realizes this is the closest he's come to peace in a long time. Morning arrives in a slow wash of light. They break camp and continue west, passing into the unaligned territories. The terrain shifts to rolling dunes and rocky plateaus, the climate growing warmer. Each day, they drive further from the war's front lines. Each night, they find meager shelter, huddling together for safety. Their supplies dwindle, but hope fuels them. At last, on a crimson dusk, they crest a hill that overlooks a sprawling desert. Far in the distance, the silhouettes of ancient ruins rise, rumored to be a haven for smugglers and refugees. Kale stops the transport, letting the engine idle as they stare at the new horizon. Zayari steps out, shading her eyes from the sun. Laika clings to her side, face full of quiet wonder. Isla stands behind them, shoulders squared, rifle strapped across her back. Kale joins them, resting a hand on Zayari's shoulder. None of them speak, but the unspoken realization binds them. They've left behind everything they knew for this uncertain freedom. Zayari's tail flicks, stirring desert dust. She glances at Kale, a hint of a smile curving her lips. We made it. He nods, the tension in his chest unraveling. We did. Behind them, the war might continue, battles raging in distant frontiers. But here, on the threshold of a new life, they stand as a ragged family forged by conflict and sealed by defiance. Kale kneels, beckoning Laika closer. The child steps up, her large eyes flicking between him and her mother. He scoops her up, settling her on his hip. She clings to his neck, a soft purr resonating against his chest. Zayari leans in, pressing a kiss to Laika's temple, then meets Kale's gaze. There's no vow spoken, no formal pledge. Only the certainty that they've chosen each other, transcending species and war. The gentle desert wind carries their quiet promise under the reddening sky. They climb back into the transport, engines rumbling. With Isla riding shotgun and Zayari keeping Laika close, Kale steers them down the slope toward the ruins. The path ahead is dangerous, but it's theirs. Together, they'll carve out a sanctuary, no longer bound by the orders of armies or the hatred between their peoples. One road ends, another begins, an ending that feels like deliverance, and a beginning forged in the primal heat of a forbidden love. They drive onward, dust trailing in their wake, leaving behind a battlefield for the uncharted freedom of a tomorrow that belongs to them alone.